The year was 1467, and Japan was about to tear itself apart. For over a century, the Ashikaga shogunate had maintained a fragile peace over the island nation. But that peace was built on shifting alliances, competing ambitions, and the delicate balance of power between rival clans. Now, as cherry blossoms fell like snow across Kyoto, that balance was about to shatter forever. What began as a succession dispute between two branches of the Ashikaga family would ignite a century of warfare that would reshape Japan's political, social, and cultural landscape. This was the beginning of the Sengoku period, the age of warring states, when the way of the warrior would reach both its greatest heights and its most brutal depths. In the elegant halls of Kyoto's imperial court, courtiers still practiced the refined arts of poetry and calligraphy, believing that civilization rested in their gentle hands. But beyond the capital's ancient walls, a new kind of leader was emerging from the provinces, men who understood that power came not from noble bloodlines or imperial favor, but from the edge of a sword and the loyalty of those willing to wield it. These were the Sengoku daimyo, the warring lords who would carve Japan into a patchwork of independent domains, each ruled by strength of arms and depth of ambition. They were practical men, willing to embrace new technologies, forge unconventional alliances, and break ancient traditions if it meant victory on the battlefield. Among them would rise figures whose names would echo through history. Oda Nobunaga, the demon lord who sought to unify Japan through fire and blood. Toyotomi Hideyoshi, the peasant who became a ruler through cunning and charisma. Tokugawa Ieyasu, the patient fox who outlasted all his rivals to found a dynasty that would endure for centuries. But the Sengoku period was more than just the story of great leaders. It was the crucible in which the samurai spirit was forged into its final form. The refined warriors of the Heian court gave way to hardened fighters who lived and died by the sword. The romantic ideals of single combat evolved into the brutal realities of mass warfare, and from this chaos emerged not just a unified nation, but a warrior ethos that would define Japanese culture for generations to come. The Onin War began with a question that had plagued Japanese politics for centuries. Who had the right to rule? In 1467, the 8th Ashikaga shogun, Yoshimasa, faced a succession crisis that would ignite a decade of warfare and destroy the last vestiges of centralized authority in Japan. Yoshimasa had planned to retire and pass power to his younger brother, Yoshimi, who had been recalled from Buddhist monastic life to serve as heir. But then fate intervened in the form of an unexpected son, Yoshihisa, born to Yoshimasa's wife Tomiko. Suddenly there were two potential successors, each backed by powerful factions within the warrior elite. The eastern faction, led by Hosokawa Katsumoto, supported Yoshimi's claim. The western faction, commanded by Yamana Sozan, backed the infant Yoshihisa and his ambitious mother. But these men were not motivated purely by loyalty to their chosen candidates. They were fighting for control of the shogunate itself, and through it, mastery over all Japan. Hosokawa Katsumoto was a man of traditional samurai values, believing in the importance of honor, ritual, and established precedent. He saw himself as the guardian of proper order, fighting to preserve the institutions that had maintained peace for over a century. His forces wore white banners and fought with disciplined precision, employing classical samurai tactics of mounted archery and individual combat. Yamana Sozan, by contrast, was a pragmatist who understood that the old ways were failing. He commanded the largest private army in Japan, drawn from his vast holdings in western Honshu, and he was willing to employ new tactics and technologies if they brought victory. His red banners became synonymous with innovation and ruthless efficiency. The war that erupted between these factions transformed Kyoto from the peaceful center of Japanese civilization into a smoking ruin. Palaces that had stood for centuries were burned to the ground. Temples and shrines became fortresses, their sacred grounds trampled by armies of warriors. The emperor himself became a virtual prisoner, his court scattered and his authority reduced to ceremonial irrelevance. But the most significant consequence of the Onin War was not the destruction of Kyoto, or even the collapse of the Ashikaga shogunate's real power. It was the demonstration that Japan's traditional institutions were no longer capable of maintaining order. Provincial lords who had once looked to Kyoto for leadership now realized they could only depend on their own strength. Across the country, local strongmen began asserting independence. They fortified their domains, raised larger armies, and stopped sending tribute to Kyoto. The intricate web of personal relationships and ceremonial obligations that had held Japan together for centuries snapped like overstretched silk. In its place emerged a new reality. Only the strong would survive. The Onin War officially ended in 1477, but its effects rippled across Japan for the next century and a half. What had been a unified if decentralized kingdom became a chaotic collection of independent territories, each ruled by whoever could hold it by force. This was the political landscape that would nurture the rise of the greatest warriors in Japanese history. From the ashes of the old order emerged a new breed of leader, the Sengoku daimyo, or warring lords. These men were different from the traditional nobility in fundamental ways. Where aristocrats had inherited their positions through bloodline and court favor, the Sengoku daimyo seized power through military conquest and political cunning. When nobles had been bound by ancient customs and ceremonial obligations, the new lords were pragmatic innovators who adapted to changing circumstances. The most successful Sengoku daimyo shared certain characteristics that distinguished them from their predecessors. They were, first and foremost, military leaders who understood that political power flowed from the barrel of a gun, or in their case from the edge of a sword and the point of a spear. They built professional armies that were larger, better trained, and more disciplined than anything Japan had seen since the Mongol invasions of the 13th century. But military prowess alone was not enough. The Sengoku daimyo were also skilled administrators who understood that lasting power required economic foundations. They reformed taxation systems, encouraged trade and agriculture, and invested in infrastructure projects that increased their domain's wealth and productivity. They were early adopters of new technologies, particularly firearms, which they integrated into their military forces despite the initial resistance of traditional samurai. Perhaps most importantly, the Sengoku daimyo were masters of what we might now call human resource management. They understood that loyalty could not be assumed but had to be earned and constantly reinforced. They created new systems of rewards and punishments that bound their followers to them through self-interest as well as honor. They were skilled at diplomacy and alliance building, recognizing that today's enemy might be tomorrow's ally. In the constantly shifting landscape of Sengoku politics, one of the earliest and most successful examples of this new breed was Hojo Soon, who rose from obscure origins to become the founder of the powerful late Hojo clan. Born as Issei Shinkoro around 1432, he began his career as a minor retainer in the service of the Imagawa family. But through a combination of military skill, political cunning and sheer audacity, he carved out an independent domain in the Kanto region that would dominate eastern Japan for nearly a century. Soon's rise began in 1493 when he seized Odawara Castle through a combination of treachery and bold action. According to legend, he disguised his soldiers as merchants and had them enter the castle during a festival, then revealed their true identity at a pre-arranged signal. Whether or not this story is accurate, it captures the essence of Soon's approach. He was willing to use any means necessary to achieve his goals, regardless of traditional notions of honor or proper behavior. Once established at Odawara, Soon set about creating the kind of efficient military administrative state that would become the model for successful Sengoku domain. He divided his territory into clearly defined administrative units, each overseen by appointed officials responsible for taxation, military recruitment, and law enforcement. He created detailed written codes that governed everything from military service to agricultural production, replacing the informal customs and personal relationships that had characterized earlier forms of governance. soon also understood the importance of legitimacy in maintaining power. Although he had seized Odawara through force and deception, he worked tirelessly to present himself as a legitimate ruler who governed in the interests of his people. He adopted the prestigious Hojo name, linking himself to the great Hojo regents who had ruled Japan in the 30s. He patronized Buddhist temples and Shinto shrines, demonstrating his respect for religious traditions, and he cultivated relationships with merchants and farmers, recognizing that their prosperity was essential to his own power. The Hojo domain that soon created became a model for other ambitious leaders across Japan. Its combination of military strength, administrative efficiency, and economic prosperity demonstrated that the old ways of governance were obsolete. In the new age, success belonged to those who could adapt to changing circumstances, while maintaining the loyalty of their followers through effective leadership rather than inherited privilege. In the province of Owari in what is now central Japan, a young man was growing up who would reshape not just his own domain, but all of Japan. Oda Nobunaga was born in 1534 into a minor branch of a relatively small warrior family, but he possessed qualities that would make him one of the most influential figures in Japanese history: boundless ambition, strategic brilliance, and a willingness to break any tradition that stood in his way. Nobunaga's early years gave little indication of the greatness that lay ahead. His father, Oda Nobunaga, was a competent local leader who had managed to expand the family's holdings through a series of small-scale conflicts with neighboring clans. But Owari was hardly a major power in Sengoku politics, and the Oda were overshadowed by larger neighbors like the Imagawa and the Matsudaira. The young Nobunaga was considered something of a disappointment by his family and retainers. Unlike other samurai youth who were expected to display refined manners and classical education, Nobunaga preferred the company of commoners and showed little interest in traditional pursuits like poetry or calligraphy. He dressed in unconventional clothing, spoke in crude language, and engaged in behavior that scandalized his elders. But those who dismissed Nobunaga as a wastrel failed to understand that his apparent eccentricity concealed a sharp intelligence and an intuitive understanding of the changing nature of warfare and politics. While other young samurai were memorizing classical texts and practicing traditional martial arts, Nobunaga was learning about firearms from Portuguese traders, studying the tactics of successful generals, and developing relationships with merchants and artisans who would prove crucial to his later success. When Nobunaga died in 1551, leaving 17-year-old Nobunaga as head of the Oda clan, many expected the young lord to fail quickly. The domain was surrounded by enemies, divided by internal factions, and lacking in the resources needed to compete with larger neighbors. Traditional thinking suggested that Nobunaga should seek protection from a more powerful lord, perhaps becoming a vassal of the mighty Imagawa clan that dominated the region. Instead, Nobunaga chose to fight. His first major test came in 1560, when Imagawa Yoshimoto, one of the most powerful daimyo in Japan, invaded Owari with an army of 25,000 men. Yoshimoto was marching toward Kyoto with the intention of establishing himself as shogun, and Owari lay directly in his path. Most observers expected Nobunaga to surrender or flee. His own advisors urged him to seek terms with the invader, but Nobunaga saw opportunity where others saw disaster. The Imagawa army was large but overconfident, spread out across the countryside and poorly coordinated. Yoshimoto himself was traveling in the center of the column, protected by his personal retainers but separated from the main body of his forces. If Nobunaga could strike quickly and precisely, he might be able to kill or capture the enemy commander and throw the entire invasion into chaos. The Battle of Okahazama, fought on June 12, 1560, would become one of the most famous engagements in Japanese military history. Using intelligence gathered by his network of spies and scouts, Nobunaga identified Yoshimoto's exact location and planned a daring surprise attack. He divided his small force of 3,000 men into multiple columns, each approaching the enemy from a different direction to maximize confusion and prevent coordinated resistance. The attack came during a thunderstorm that masked the sound of Nobunaga's approach and reduced visibility for the defenders. Bursting out of the forest like avenging demons, Nobunaga's warriors fell upon Yoshimoto's camp with devastating effect. The Imagawa commander, caught completely off guard, was killed in the first moments of the assault along with most of his senior retainers. Leaderless and demoralized, the massive Imagawa army dissolved into chaos, with thousands of soldiers abandoning their weapons and fleeing for their lives. Okahazama was more than just a military victory. It was a demonstration that the old certainties of Sengoku warfare no longer applied. A small, well-led force using innovative tactics had destroyed an army 10 times its size. Speed, intelligence, and surprise had proven more valuable than numbers or traditional prestige. And most importantly, it announced to all Japan that Oda Nobunaga was a new kind of leader who could not be judged by conventional standards. The victory at Okahazama made Nobunaga's reputation, but it was his systematic transformation of Japanese warfare that made him truly revolutionary. Unlike other daimyo who incorporated new weapons and tactics piecemeal, Nobunaga completely reimagined how wars should be fought, creating military innovations that would define Japanese warfare for centuries to come. The most visible aspect of Nobunaga's military revolution was his embrace of firearms. Portuguese traders had introduced arquebus rifles to Japan in 1543, but most samurai treated them as curiosities rather than practical weapons. They were slow to reload, inaccurate at long range, and seemed to lack the honor and skill associated with traditional weapons like swords and bows. Many warriors considered firearms to be beneath their dignity, suitable only for common foot soldiers rather than noble samurai. Nobunaga saw things differently. He understood that firearms, whatever their limitations, possessed one crucial advantage. They could kill even the most skilled warrior with a single shot, regardless of his training, armor, or social status. This democratization of lethality appealed to Nobunaga's egalitarian instincts and his practical approach to warfare. If guns could win battles, then he would have the best guns and the most skilled gunners in Japan. Working with Portuguese merchants and Japanese craftsmen, Nobunaga established arms factories in his territories that produced thousands of firearms of steadily improving quality. He recruited and trained specialized units of ashigaru, or foot soldiers, who were equipped with matchlock rifles and trained to fight in coordinated formation. Unlike traditional samurai warfare, which emphasized individual prowess and single combat, Nobunaga's gunners fought as disciplined units that could deliver devastating volleys of fire at enemy formation. The effectiveness of Nobunaga's firearms tactics was demonstrated most dramatically at the Battle of Nagakuti in 1584, where his forces used coordinated musket fire to break a cavalry charge by the Takeda clan, whose mounted warriors were considered among the finest in Japan. The sight of proud samurai falling to common foot soldiers, armed with guns, shocked the military establishment and accelerated the adoption of firearms throughout Japan. But Nobunaga's military innovations went far beyond weapons technology. He also revolutionized military organization, logistics, and strategy in ways that made his armies more effective than any Japan had seen. Traditional samurai armies were essentially feudal levies, collections of individual warriors who served their lord in exchange for land grants, and served only during specific campaigns. They were expensive to maintain, difficult to coordinate, and limited in their operational flexibility. Nobunaga created what was essentially Japan's first professional military force. His core units were full-time soldiers who trained constantly, received regular pay, and could be deployed anywhere at any time. They were organized into standardized formations with clear chains of command and specialized roles. Engineers handled siegecraft and fortification. Cavalry provided reconnaissance and rapid response. Infantry formed the backbone of his battle lines, and artillery units provided heavy fire support. Equally important was Nobunaga's approach to military logistics. Traditional armies lived off the land, foraging for supplies and depending on the cooperation of local populations. This limited their operational range and made long campaigns nearly impossible. Nobunaga established permanent supply bases, organized transportation networks, and created specialized units responsible for provisioning his forces. His armies could operate far from their home bases for extended periods, giving him strategic flexibility that his enemies could not match. Nobunaga also pioneered new approaches to siegecraft that made traditional fortifications obsolete. Instead of conducting lengthy sieges that could drag on for months or years, he developed techniques for rapid assault that combined artillery bombardment, sapping operations, and coordinated infantry attacks. His engineers became masters of castle breaking, developing specialized equipment and tactics that could reduce even the strongest fortifications in a matter of days. As Nobunaga revolutionized the practice of warfare, he also challenged the traditional code of honor that had governed samurai behavior for centuries. The Bushido ideal that later generations would romanticize was still evolving during the Sengoku period, and different warriors interpreted its requirements in very different ways. Traditional samurai culture emphasized personal honor, individual prowess, and loyalty to one's lord above all else. Warriors were expected to fight with specific weapons in prescribed ways, to announce their names and lineages before engaging enemies, and to seek worthy opponents in single combat. Death in battle was preferable to defeat or surrender, and a warrior who failed in his duties was expected to commit seppuku to restore his honor. Nobunaga respected courage and loyalty, but he had little patience for traditions that interfered with military effectiveness. He cared more about winning than about fighting honorably, and he was willing to employ any tactics that brought victory. This pragmatic approach often put him at odds with traditionalist samurai, but it also attracted followers who shared his results-oriented philosophy. One of the most controversial aspects of Nobunaga's approach was his treatment of enemies and non-combatants. Traditional samurai warfare included informal rules that limited violence against civilians, religious personnel, and defeated enemies. Warriors were expected to show mercy to worthy opponents, and to respect the sanctuary of temples and shrines. These customs helped limit the destructiveness of conflicts and maintained some distinction between warfare and simple brutality. Nobunaga rejected these limitations when they served his strategic purposes. His campaign against the Iko-Ikki Buddhist sect was marked by unprecedented brutality, including the massacre of thousands of monks and the burning of their temple fortress. His suppression of resistance in conquered territories often involved the systematic execution of potential rebels and the deportation of entire populations. Critics called him the Demon Lord for his willingness to use terror as a weapon of war. But Nobunaga's harsh methods served specific purposes beyond mere cruelty. By demonstrating his willingness to destroy anyone who opposed him, he often convinced enemies to surrender without fighting, actually reducing the total amount of violence needed to achieve his goal. His reputation for ruthlessness became a strategic asset that saved lives by deterring resistance. At the same time, Nobunaga was remarkably tolerant and generous toward those who submitted to his authority. He welcomed former enemies into his service, promoted based on merit rather than birth, and showed respect for different religious traditions as long as they did not challenge his political authority. His court included Christian missionaries, Buddhist monks, Shinto priests, and Confucian scholars, all working together in relative harmony. This combination of ruthlessness toward enemies and generosity toward allies created a new model of leadership that many other daimyo would emulate. It suggested that honor lay not in following ancient customs, but in achieving the goals that justified those customs in the first place. If the ultimate purpose of the warrior's code was to protect one's lord and domain, then any means that accomplished this purpose could be considered honorable. The samurai who served under Nobunaga had to adapt their own understanding of Bushido to match this new reality. They learned to fight with guns as well as swords, to value tactical effectiveness over individual glory, and to measure their worth by their contribution to their lord's success, rather than by their adherence to traditional forms. This evolution of the warrior's code would accelerate under Nobunaga's successors, and ultimately create the distinctive samurai culture that characterized the following century. By 1570, Nobunaga had transformed his small domain in Awari into one of the most powerful and innovative military forces in Japan. But his ultimate goal was far more ambitious than mere regional dominance. He intended to unify all of Japan under his rule, ending the century of warfare that had torn the country apart since the Onin War. This was an unprecedented ambition. No single leader had controlled all of Japan since the early Heian period, over 4 centuries earlier. The country was divided among dozens of independent domains, many of them larger and wealthier than Nobunaga's own territories. The obstacles to unification seemed insurmountable. Geographical barriers that made communication and transportation difficult, cultural differences between regions, religious divisions that cut across political boundaries, and the simple fact that every other daimyo had his own ambitions for expansion. But Nobunaga possessed advantages that his rivals lacked. His military innovations gave him tactical superiority on the battlefield. His administrative reforms allowed him to mobilize resources more effectively than traditional feudal systems. His willingness to break with convention opened strategic options that his enemies could not imagine. And perhaps most importantly, he had a clear vision of what unified Japan should look like, and the determination to make that vision reality. Nobunaga's strategy for unification was both systematic and opportunistic. He identified key strategic objectives that would give him control over Japan's political and economic centers: the imperial capital at Kyoto, the commercial centers along the Tokaido Road, and the religious complexes that commanded the loyalty of millions of believers. At the same time, he remained flexible enough to exploit unexpected opportunities and adapt to changing circumstances. His first major campaign beyond his home territories targeted the powerful Asai and Asakura clans, who controlled strategic routes between the capital region and the Japan Sea coast. These clans had been traditional allies of the Oda, but they opposed Nobunaga's growing power and his unconventional methods. The conflict that erupted in 1570 would test all of Nobunaga's innovations against some of Japan's most experienced and traditional warriors. The Asai, led by the young and talented Asai Nagamasa, controlled the southern shores of Lake Biwa and the approaches to Kyoto from the north. Nagamasa was married to Nobunaga's sister Ochi, a political alliance that had been arranged to secure the friendship between their clans. But family ties proved weaker than political calculations when Nagamasa concluded that Nobunaga's ambitions threatened the independence of all the smaller domains. The Asakura clan, based in Ekizen province, were even more formidable opponents. Led by Asakura Yoshikage, they commanded one of the largest and most professional armies in Japan, with a military tradition dating back centuries. Their domain was wealthy, well-administered, and strategically located to control trade routes between central Japan and the northern province. Alliance with the Asai gave them the opportunity to check Nobunaga's expansion before it became unstoppable. The war that followed demonstrated both the potential and the limitations of Nobunaga's revolutionary approach to warfare. His innovations in tactics, technology, and organization gave him significant advantages in direct confrontations, but they could not solve all the challenges of fighting a multi-front campaign against determined enemies who knew their own territories intimately. By 1570, Nobunaga had transformed his small domain in Awari into one of the most powerful and innovative military forces in Japan. But his ultimate goal was far more ambitious than mere regional dominance. He intended to unify all of Japan under his rule, ending the century of warfare that had torn the country apart since the Onin War. This was an unprecedented ambition. No single leader had controlled all of Japan since the early Heian period, over 4 centuries earlier. The country was divided among dozens of independent domains, many of them larger and wealthier than Nobunaga's own territories. The obstacles to unification seemed insurmountable. Geographical barriers that made communication and transportation difficult, cultural differences between regions, religious divisions that cut across political boundaries, and the simple fact that every other daimyo had his own ambitions for expansion. But Nobunaga possessed advantages that his rivals lacked. His military innovations gave him tactical superiority on the battlefield. His administrative reforms allowed him to mobilize resources more effectively than traditional feudal systems. His willingness to break with convention opened strategic options that his enemies could not imagine. And perhaps most importantly, he had a clear vision of what unified Japan should look like and the determination to make that vision reality. Nobunaga's strategy for unification was both systematic and opportunistic. He identified key strategic objectives that would give him control over Japan's political and economic centers: the imperial capital at Kyoto, the commercial centers along the Tokaido Road, and the religious complexes that commanded the loyalty of millions of believers. At the same time, he remained flexible enough to exploit unexpected opportunities and adapt to changing circumstances. His first major campaign beyond his home territories targeted the powerful Asai and Asakura clans, who controlled strategic routes between the capital region and the Japan Sea coast. These clans had been traditional allies of the Oda, but they opposed Nobunaga's growing power and his unconventional methods. The conflict that erupted in 1570 would test all of Nobunaga's innovations against some of Japan's most experienced and traditional warriors. The Asai, led by the young and talented Asai Nagamasa, controlled the southern shores of Lake Biwa and the approaches to Kyoto from the north. Nagamasa was married to Nobunaga's sister Ochi, a political alliance that had been arranged to secure the friendship between their clans. But family ties proved weaker than political calculations when Nagamasa concluded that Nobunaga's ambitions threatened the independence of all the smaller domains. The Asakura clan, based in Ekizen province, were even more formidable opponents. Led by Asakura Yoshikage, they commanded one of the largest and most professional armies in Japan, with a military tradition dating back centuries. Their domain was wealthy, well-administered, and strategically located to control trade routes between central Japan and the northern province. Alliance with the Asai gave them the opportunity to check Nobunaga's expansion before it became unstoppable. The war that followed demonstrated both the potential and the limitations of Nobunaga's revolutionary approach to warfare. His innovations in tactics, technology, and organization gave him significant advantages in direct confrontations, but they could not solve all the challenges of fighting a multi-front campaign against determined enemies who knew their own territories intimately. While fighting the Asai and Asakura in the north, Nobunaga faced an even more dangerous threat from an unexpected quarter: the Ikko-Ikki, or single-minded leagues, a powerful confederation of militant Buddhist communities that controlled large portions of central Japan. These were not ordinary religious organizations, but militarized societies that combined religious fervor with sophisticated military organization and political ambition. The Ikko-Ikki had emerged during the previous century as a response to the chaos and violence of the Sengoku period, based on the teachings of Jodo Shinshu Buddhism, which emphasized salvation through faith rather than ritual or social status. These communities attracted farmers, artisans, merchants, and low-ranking samurai who felt excluded from traditional power structures. They created autonomous republics governed by religious councils and defended by armies of believers who fought with the conviction that death in battle guaranteed their salvation. The largest and most powerful of these communities was centered at Ishiyama Honganji, a massive temple fortress complex in Osaka that served as the headquarters of the Jodo Shinshu sect. Under the leadership of Kenyo, the temple's abbot, Ishiyama Honganji had become the de facto capital of an independent state that controlled trade routes, collected taxes, and maintained diplomatic relations with other powers. Its influence extended across Western Japan through a network of affiliated temples and communities that owed allegiance to the Honganji, rather than to any secular lord. For Nobunaga, the Ikko-Ikki represented both a military threat and an ideological challenge. Their control of strategic territories interfered with his unification plans, While their democratic principles and rejection of social hierarchy contradicted his vision of a unified Japan under centralized authority. Most dangerously, their religious motivation made them nearly impossible to defeat through conventional diplomatic or military means. Believers who expected to be rewarded in paradise for dying in battle were not easily intimidated or bribed. The conflict between Nobunaga and the Ieyasu began in 1570, when the Honganji formed an alliance with the Asai and Asakura clans against Oda expansion. This coalition threatened to encircle Nobunaga's territories and cut his supply lines to the capital region. Recognizing that he could not achieve his larger goals while this threat remained, Nobunaga declared war on the Ieyasu and began what would become the longest and most brutal campaign of his career. The siege of Ishiyama Honganji lasted 11 years, from 1570 to 1581, and became a test of endurance, innovation, and sheer determination that pushed both sides to their limits. The temple fortress was one of the strongest positions in Japan, protected by multiple rings of fortifications, surrounded by rivers and marshes that limited approaches, and garrisoned by thousands of fanatical defenders who preferred death to surrender. Nobunaga's first attempts to take the fortress by direct assault failed with heavy casualties. The defenders had firearms of their own, supplied by sympathetic merchants and even some Portuguese traders who were willing to sell weapons to anyone who could pay for them. They also employed innovative defensive techniques, including the use of fireships to attack Nobunaga's naval forces, and the construction of underground tunnels that allowed them to launch surprise attacks against besieging forces. Frustrated by his inability to break the fortress quickly, Nobunaga adopted a strategy of total war that would become his trademark in dealing with religious opponents. Rather than simply besieging Ishiyama Honganji, he began a systematic campaign to destroy the entire Ieyasu network throughout Japan. His armies attacked affiliated temples, massacred their inhabitants, and burned their buildings to the ground. Entire communities that had supported the Ieyasu were relocated or exterminated, their lands redistributed to Nobunaga's followers. This campaign of terror served multiple purposes. It deprived Ishiyama Honganji of external support, demonstrated the fate that awaited continued resistance, and eliminated potential centers of future rebellion. But it also established Nobunaga's reputation as an enemy of Buddhism and a destroyer of sacred traditions, earning him lasting hostility from religious conservatives throughout Japan. As Nobunaga consolidated his control over central Japan, he faced his greatest military challenge yet from the east, the Takeda clan of Kai province, led by one of the most formidable warriors of the age, Takeda Shingen. The Takeda were renowned throughout Japan for their cavalry, which was considered the finest in the country, and for their innovative military tactics that had made them dominant in the mountainous regions of central Honshu. Takeda Shingen was everything that Nobunaga was not: a traditional warrior who embodied classical samurai virtues, a master of conventional tactics, and a leader who inspired fierce personal loyalty through his adherence to Bushido principles. His domain was smaller and poorer than Nobunaga's, but his army was arguably the most professional and experienced fighting force in Japan. The inevitable confrontation between these two powers would test whether innovation could triumph over tradition, whether new methods could overcome old virtues. The conflict began in 1572 when Shingen launched a major offensive aimed at capturing Kyoto and establishing himself as shogun. His strategy was to advance along the Tokugawa Road, defeating Nobunaga's allies one by one, until he could challenge the Oda directly for control of the capital region. The campaign began brilliantly, with Takeda forces overwhelming several of Nobunaga's fortified positions and advancing deep into Mikawa province. Nobunaga's primary ally in the region was Tokugawa Ieyasu, a young daimyo who controlled the strategic castle of Hamamatsu and commanded the loyalty of the local population. Ieyasu was in an impossible position. His forces were too small to face the Takeda army directly, but retreat would mean abandoning his domain to enemy occupation. The solution he chose would demonstrate both his tactical skill and his understanding of his enemy's psychology. At the Battle of Mimasetoge, fought on December 22, 1572, Ieyasu employed a defensive strategy that turned Takeda's strengths against themselves. Rather than meeting the enemy cavalry charge head-on, he positioned his forces on a hillside with prepared defensive positions and carefully planned fields of fire for his matchlock units. When the Takeda attacked with their traditional mounted assault, they found themselves channeled into killing zones where disciplined volleys of musket fire decimated their ranks. The battle was a tactical victory for Nobunaga's coalition, but it came at enormous cost. Many of Ieyasu's most experienced retainers were killed or wounded, and his domain was left vulnerable to further attack. More importantly, the battle demonstrated that even the finest traditional cavalry could be defeated by well-positioned firearms, a lesson that would reshape Japanese military thinking for the remainder of the Sengoku period. Takeda Shingen himself died in 1573, possibly from wounds sustained at Mimasetoge, though some sources suggest he succumbed to illness during the campaign. His death removed the most capable military leader opposing Nobunaga's expansion and left the Takeda clan under the leadership of his son Katsuyori, a brave but impetuous warrior who lacked his father's strategic wisdom and political skill. The younger Takeda proved vulnerable to the kind of tactical innovations that Nobunaga had been developing throughout his career. At the Battle of Nogakute in 1575, Nobunaga employed massed formations of ashigari, armed with matchlocks, to break a Takeda cavalry charge, demonstrating conclusively that firearms had revolutionized battlefield tactics. The sight of proud samurai falling to common foot soldiers marked the end of an era and the beginning of a new age in Japanese war. By 1575, Nobunaga controlled approximately half of Japan's provinces, but his most dangerous enemies were not other daimyo, but the religious institutions that commanded the loyalty of millions of believers. The destruction of the Ikoiki had demonstrated his willingness to use extreme violence against Buddhist opponents, but two other religious centers still posed significant threats to his authority: the great monastery complex on Mount Hiei and the warrior monks of Kofukuji in Nara. Mount Hiei had been the center of Japanese Buddhism for over 8 centuries, home to the prestigious Enryakuji temple complex that had trained many of the country's most influential religious leaders. The mountain's monasteries controlled vast estates throughout Japan, maintained their own armies of warrior monks, and exercised enormous political influence through their connections to the imperial court and aristocratic families. They had repeatedly interfered in secular politics, using their military forces to pressure the government and protect their economic interests. For Nobunaga, Mount Hiei represented everything he despised about Japan's traditional power structures: an institution that claimed authority based on ancient privileges rather than current effectiveness, that maintained private armies while refusing to accept centralized control, and that put religious interests above national unity. The monks' resistance to his authority made them enemies. Their influence over the population made them dangerous enemies. In September 1577, Nobunaga launched what would become known as the destruction of Mount Hiei, one of the most controversial actions of his career. His forces surrounded the mountain and systematically burned every building on its peaks, killing thousands of monks and destroying centuries of accumulated religious art, literature, and scholarship. The attack was so thorough that contemporary observers compared it to the destruction of Buddhism in India by Muslim invaders centuries earlier. The massacre at Mount Hiei shocked even Nobunaga's supporters and earned him lasting enmity from Buddhist believers throughout Japan. Critics accused him of destroying Japan's spiritual heritage for purely political reasons, while supporters argued that drastic action was necessary to break the political power of religious institutions that had become corrupt and self-serving. The debate would continue for generations, but the immediate result was clear: no religious institution would dare to challenge Nobunaga's authority again. With the destruction of his major religious opponents, Nobunaga turned his attention to the final phase of his unification campaign, the conquest of the remaining independent domains, and the establishment of a new political system that would prevent future civil war. His targets included some of the most powerful and prestigious clans in Japan, including the Mori of Western Honshu, the Uesugi of Echigo, and the remaining Takeda territories in the mountains of central Japan. These final campaigns would test not only Nobunaga's military innovations but also his ability to create lasting political institutions. Military conquest was only the first step toward true unification. He also needed to develop systems of administration, taxation, and governance that could hold his vast territories together after the fighting ended. The challenges he faced were unprecedented in Japanese history, and the solutions he developed would influence Japanese politics for centuries to come. As 5082 dawned, Oda Nobunaga stood at the pinnacle of his power. He controlled more of Japan than any single leader in over 4 centuries. His armies were the most advanced and disciplined in the country, and his remaining enemies were either too weak to challenge him directly, or too distant to pose immediate threats. Yet for all his military success, Nobunaga's greatest achievement may have been his vision of what a unified Japan could become. Unlike previous attempts at unification, which had focused primarily on military conquest and political control, Nobunaga understood that lasting unity required fundamental changes in Japanese society, economy, and culture. He was not content merely to become another shogun ruling through traditional feudal relationships. He wanted to create an entirely new kind of state that would be strong enough to resist both internal rebellion and foreign invasion. Central to this vision was the concept of centralized authority backed by modern military technology. Nobunaga had demonstrated that traditional samurai warfare was obsolete in the face of disciplined infantry armed with firearms. He intended to use this military advantage to break the power of the old aristocracy and replace it with a meritocratic system where advancement depended on ability rather than birth. His own rise from provincial obscurity to national dominance proved that such transformation was possible. Economic reform was equally important to Nobunaga's plans. The Sengoku period had been characterized by constant warfare, partly because Japan's fragmented political system made trade difficult and economic development uneven. Different domains used different currencies, imposed different taxes, and maintained different legal systems, creating barriers to commerce that impoverished the entire country. Nobunaga intended to create a unified economic zone with standardized weights, measures, and currencies that would promote trade and generate the wealth needed to support a modern state. Religious policy was perhaps the most controversial aspect of Nobunaga's vision. His destruction of Buddhist political power had been necessary for military reasons, but he also believed that Japan's traditional religious institutions were obstacles to modernization and national unity. The complex web of competing Buddhist sects, Shinto shrines, and folk traditions created divided loyalties that undermined political authority. Nobunaga favored a more rationalized approach to religion that would subordinate spiritual institutions to secular authority while still respecting individual beliefs. Perhaps most radically, Nobunaga was open to foreign ideas and technologies in ways that most Japanese leaders were not. His embrace of firearms was just one example of his willingness to adopt useful innovations regardless of their origin. He welcomed Christian missionaries, Portuguese traders, and other foreigners to his court, recognizing that Japan could benefit from contact with the wider world. This cosmopolitan outlook would prove influential in shaping Japan's later development. The governmental system that Nobunaga was developing combined elements of traditional Japanese administration with innovations borrowed from Chinese and European models. At the local level, he retained the existing structure of domains ruled by daimyo, but he required these lords to accept his supreme authority and follow his policy. At the national level, he was creating new institutions for military command, economic planning, and diplomatic relations that would give the central government unprecedented control over the entire country. But Nobunaga's vision extended beyond mere political and economic reform. He understood that true unification required cultural changes that would create a sense of shared Japanese identity transcending local loyalty. His promotion of new artistic styles, his standardization of legal codes, and his encouragement of social mobility were all designed to break down the barriers between different regions and social classes. He wanted to create a Japan where talent and loyalty mattered more than birth and tradition. The infrastructure projects that Nobunaga initiated during his later years reflected this comprehensive approach to national development. His engineers built new roads, bridges, and harbor facilities that connected previously isolated regions. His administrators established postal systems, standardized legal codes, and created records-keeping procedures that made efficient governance possible across vast territories. His economic policies encouraged agriculture, promoted trade, and fostered the development of new industry. Military reform remained central to all these efforts. Nobunaga was creating what amounted to Japan's first national army, with standardized equipment, training, and organization that transcended regional differences. His officer corps included men from all parts of Japan, selected for ability rather than local connections. His logistical systems could support large-scale operations anywhere in the country. Most importantly, his military forces were loyal to him personally rather than to any regional lord or traditional institution. Yet even as Nobunaga approached the realization of his vision, he faced challenges that military force alone could not overcome. Many Japanese remained attached to traditional ways of life and suspicious of his reforms. Regional identities were stronger than national loyalty for most people. Religious conservatives continued to oppose his policies despite the destruction of their institutional power. And foreign contact, while beneficial in many ways, also brought new dangers and complications that previous Japanese leaders had never faced. Perhaps most dangerously, Nobunaga's success had created a situation where his personal survival became essential to the stability of the entire system he had built. Unlike traditional feudal arrangements which were based on impersonal relationships and inherited obligations, Nobunaga's new order depended heavily on his individual leadership and the loyalty he had earned through his achievements. This made the entire structure vulnerable to the kind of sudden catastrophe that had characterized the Sengoku period from its beginning. On June 20, Nobunaga was staying at Honnoji Temple in Kyoto with only a small bodyguard when one of his most trusted retainers, Akechi Mitsuhide, surrounded the building with an army and set it on fire. Caught completely by surprise and outnumbered, Nobunaga chose to die fighting rather than surrender or escape. His death marked the end of one phase of Japanese unification and the beginning of another, as his surviving retainers fought among themselves for the right to complete his work. The incident at Honnoji, as it came to be known, demonstrated both the achievements and the limitations of Nobunaga's approach to unification. He had proven that traditional Japanese political systems were obsolete, and that new forms of organization were both possible and necessary. His military, economic, and administrative innovations would influence Japanese development for centuries, but his reliance on personal leadership rather than institutional structures made his accomplishments vulnerable to the kind of sudden reversal that had characterized the entire Sengoku period. The man who would ultimately complete Nobunaga's work was already moving to avenge his death and claim his inheritance. Toyotomi Hideyoshi, the peasant who had become Nobunaga's most capable general, was about to begin his own remarkable rise to power. Hideyoshi's victory at Yamazaki made him the most powerful figure in the former Oda domains, but it did not automatically make him Nobunaga's successor. The Oda coalition included several other generals who had their own claims to leadership, their own armies, and their own ambitions for the future of Japan. The question of who would inherit Nobunaga's position would be decided not by legal precedent or family relationships, but by political skill and military strength. The most obvious candidate for succession was Oda Nobunaga, Nobunaga's third son, who had the advantage of legitimate blood relationship and the support of traditionalist retainers who believed in hereditary succession. Nobunaga was a capable military commander who had proven himself in several campaigns, and his claim was strengthened by the fact that Nobunaga's eldest son, Nobunaga, had died with his father at Honnoji, while the second son, Nobutatsu, was considered too weak and incompetent to lead. But Hideyoshi had positioned himself as the guardian of Nobunaga's infant grandson, Samboshi, later known as Oda Hidenobu, arguing that the child represented the legitimate continuation of the Oda line while he himself served merely as regent and protector. This strategy allowed him to claim legitimacy while exercising real power, avoiding the appearance of usurpation while building support among those who valued loyalty and continuity. The most dangerous challenger to Hideyoshi's position was Shibata Kotsuya, Nobunaga's oldest and most senior retainer, who controlled large territories in northern Japan and commanded the loyalty of many traditional samurai. Kotsuya was a formidable warrior who embodied classical samurai virtues and enjoyed widespread respect among the military class. He allied himself with Nobutaka and other Oda family members, creating a powerful coalition that threatened to overwhelm Hideyoshi's forces through sheer military strength. The conflict that developed between these factions was more than just a succession dispute. It was a struggle between different visions of what Japan's future should look like. Kotsuya and his allies represented continuity with traditional samurai culture, hereditary authority and established social hierarchies. Hideyoshi represented innovation, meritocracy, and the possibility that Japan could be ruled by someone whose authority derived from ability rather than birth. The decisive confrontation came in 1583 at the Battle of Shizugatake, where Hideyoshi demonstrated both his tactical brilliance and his ability to inspire extraordinary loyalty among his followers. Faced with a larger enemy force in a strong defensive position, Hideyoshi employed the kind of rapid, coordinated assault that had become his trademark, combining frontal attacks with flanking movements that confused and demoralized his opponent. But the battle was won as much by morale as by tactics. Hideyoshi's forces fought with a determination and coordination that reflected their confidence in their leader and their belief in his cause. They were fighting not just for victory in a single engagement, but for the chance to complete the unification of Japan under a leader who represented their own aspirations for social mobility and merit-based advancement. Kotsuya's defeat at Shizugatake effectively ended organized resistance to Hideyoshi's authority within the former Oda domains. The old general, recognizing that his cause was hopeless, committed seppuku along with his wife, who was Nobunaga's sister, rather than face capture and execution. His death marked the end of an era and the beginning of a new phase in Japanese history, when traditional aristocratic authority would give way to a more dynamic and inclusive form of leadership. With his position secure within the Oda coalition, Hideyoshi could turn his attention to the larger task that Nobunaga had left unfinished, the complete unification of Japan. But where Nobunaga had relied primarily on military conquest and administrative reform, Hideyoshi would employ a more sophisticated strategy that combined warfare with diplomacy, economic incentives with political pressure, and innovation with respect for tradition. Hideyoshi's victory at Yamazaki made him the most powerful figure in the former Oda domains, but it did not automatically make him Nobunaga's successor. The Oda coalition included several other generals who had their own claims to leadership, their own armies, and their own ambitions for the future of Japan. The question of who would inherit Nobunaga's position would be decided not by legal precedent or family relationships, but by political skill and military strength. The most obvious candidate for succession was Oda Nobunaga, Nobunaga's third son, who had the advantage of legitimate blood relationship and the support of traditionalist retainers who believed in hereditary succession. Nobutaka was a capable military commander who had proven himself in several campaigns, and his claim was strengthened by the fact that Nobunaga's eldest son, Nobunaga, had died with his father at Honnoji, while the second son, Nobutatsu, was considered too weak and incompetent to lead. But Hideyoshi had positioned himself as the guardian of Nobunaga's infant grandson, Samboshi, later known as Oda Hidenobu, arguing that the child represented the legitimate continuation of the Oda line while he himself served merely as regent and protector. This strategy allowed him to claim legitimacy while exercising real power, avoiding the appearance of usurpation while building support among those who valued loyalty and continuity. The most dangerous challenger to Hideyoshi's position was Shibata Kotsuya, Nobunaga's oldest and most senior retainer, who controlled large territories in northern Japan and commanded the loyalty of many traditional samurai. Kotsuya was a formidable warrior who embodied classical samurai virtues and enjoyed widespread respect among the military class. He allied himself with Nobutaka and other Oda family members, creating a powerful coalition that threatened to overwhelm Hideyoshi's forces through sheer military strength. The conflict that developed between these factions was more than just a succession dispute. It was a struggle between different visions of what Japan's future should look like. Kotsuya and his allies represented continuity with traditional samurai culture, hereditary authority and established social hierarchies. Hideyoshi represented innovation, meritocracy, and the possibility that Japan could be ruled by someone whose authority derived from ability rather than birth. The decisive confrontation came in 1583 at the Battle of Shizugatake, where Hideyoshi demonstrated both his tactical brilliance and his ability to inspire extraordinary loyalty among his followers. Faced with a larger enemy force in a strong defensive position, Hideyoshi employed the kind of rapid, coordinated assault that had become his trademark, combining frontal attacks with flanking movements that confused and demoralized his opponent. But the battle was won as much by morale as by tactics. Hideyoshi's forces fought with a determination and coordination that reflected their confidence in their leader and their belief in his cause. They were fighting not just for victory in a single engagement, but for the chance to complete the unification of Japan under a leader who represented their own aspirations for social mobility and merit-based advancement. Kotsuya's defeat at Shizugatake effectively ended organized resistance to Hideyoshi's authority within the former Oda domains. The old general, recognizing that his cause was hopeless, committed seppuku along with his wife, who was Nobunaga's sister, rather than face capture and execution. His death marked the end of an era and the beginning of a new phase in Japanese history, when traditional aristocratic authority would give way to a more dynamic and inclusive form of leadership. With his positions secure within the Oda coalition, Hideyoshi could turn his attention to the larger task that Nobunaga had left unfinished, the complete unification of Japan. But where Nobunaga had relied primarily on military conquest and administrative reform, Hideyoshi would employ a more sophisticated strategy that combined warfare with diplomacy, economic incentives with political pressure, and innovation with respect for tradition. By 1585, Hideyoshi controlled most of central and western Honshu, but two major regions remained outside his authority: the southern island of Kyushu and the northern domains of the Tohoku region. These areas were not only geographically distant from his power base, but also culturally distinct, with their own traditions, dialects, and political systems that had developed in relative isolation from central Japanese politics. Kyushu presented particular challenges because it was dominated by several powerful clans that had been fighting among themselves for generations, but were likely to unite against any outside threat. The Shimazu clan controlled the southern portion of the island from their base in Satsuma. The Otomo dominated the northeast from Bungo, and smaller clans like the Ryuzoji and Arima held territories in between. Each had developed distinctive military traditions and tactical innovations adapted to local conditions. The Shimazu were perhaps the most formidable of these opponents. Led by the brilliant strategist Shimazu Yoshihisa, they had developed a unique approach to warfare that combined traditional samurai cavalry with innovative use of terrain and coordinated infantry tactics. Their signature move, known as the Shimazu retreat, involved feigning withdrawal to draw enemies into prepared ambush positions where superior numbers could be negated by tactical advantage. Hideyoshi's campaign to conquer Kyushu, launched in 1586, would demonstrate his evolution as a military commander and his mastery of the logistical challenges involved in projecting power across large distances. Unlike his earlier campaigns, which had been fought relatively close to his home base, the Kyushu operation required him to transport large armies across water, establish supply lines over hostile territory, and coordinate multiple simultaneous operations across an island larger than many European countries. The key to Hideyoshi's success was his recognition that traditional siege warfare was inadequate for the kind of rapid conquest he needed to achieve. The strong fortifications that dotted Kyushu could resist conventional attacks for months or years, and prolonged sieges would give his enemies time to organize effective resistance and potentially seek foreign assistance. Instead, he developed new siege techniques that combined overwhelming force with psychological pressure to achieve rapid capitulation. Central to this approach was Hideyoshi's use of what he called overwhelming presence, the deployment of forces so large and so obviously superior that resistance seemed futile. Rather than surrounding a single castle with just enough troops to prevent relief, he would bring armies of 100,000 or more to invest relatively minor positions, creating a spectacle of power that impressed both defenders and potential allies throughout the region. These massive deployments were made possible by Hideyoshi's revolutionary approach to military logistics. Unlike traditional Japanese armies which lived off the land and depended on local cooperation for supplies, Hideyoshi's forces brought their own provisions, equipment and even building materials for siege work. His supply trains included not only food and weapons but also carpenters, engineers and specialized craftsmen who could quickly construct the infrastructure needed for extended operations. The psychological impact of these preparations was as important as their practical effect. When defending commanders saw vast armies approaching with obviously unlimited supplies and equipment, accompanied by siege engines and engineering specialists, they understood that they faced not just a military assault but a systematic process of destruction that would inevitably succeed regardless of their courage or skill. Hideyoshi's siege of Odawara Castle in 1590 became the model for this new approach to fortress warfare. The castle, held by the powerful Hojo clan, was one of the strongest positions in Japan, protected by multiple rings of fortifications and garrisoned by experienced warriors who had successfully resisted previous attacks. Traditional siege methods would have required years to reduce such a position, time that Hideyoshi could not afford. Instead, he surrounded the castle with an army of over 200,000 men, the largest military force ever assembled in Japanese history to that point. But rather than launching costly assault after assault, he essentially built a temporary city around the fortress, complete with markets, entertainment districts and comfortable quarters for his officers. The defenders could see that their enemies were prepared to maintain the siege indefinitely, while they themselves were cut off from all outside support and facing steadily diminishing supplies. The siege became a demonstration of the benefits of cooperation with Hideyoshi's regime as much as a military operation. Merchants, artisans and entertainers flocked to the siege camp, creating a prosperous community that showcased the economic opportunities available to those who accepted unified rule. The contrast between the vibrant activity outside the walls and the increasingly desperate conditions within was not lost on the defenders or on observers throughout Japan. When the Hojo finally surrendered after 3 months, they did so not because their walls had been breached or their warriors defeated, but because continued resistance had become obviously pointless. Hideyoshi's treatment of the defeated clan was characteristically generous. While the leaders were required to commit seppuku for their defiance, their followers were welcomed into his service and their territories were redistributed among loyal retainers. With the military conquest of Japan essentially complete by 1590, Hideyoshi faced the challenge of creating political and social institutions that could maintain unity without requiring constant military intervention. His solution was a series of sweeping reforms that would fundamentally reshape Japanese society and establish the framework for the peaceful Edo period that would follow. But the most famous and controversial of these reforms was the katana gari or sword hunt of 1588. Which required all non-samurai to surrender their weapons to government authorities. This policy was revolutionary in its scope and implications, representing the first systematic attempt to create a monopoly on legitimate violence in Japanese history. Traditional Japanese society had been characterized by relatively fluid social boundaries and widespread weapon ownership. Farmers, merchants, and artisans routinely carried swords for self-defense, and many had military experience from the constant warfare of the Sengoku period. Local militias and religious organizations maintained arsenals that could be used for community defense or political resistance. This decentralized distribution of military capability had been one of the factors that made regional independence possible and central authority difficult to maintain. Hideyoshi understood that lasting unification required more than just defeating rival armies. It demanded fundamental changes in the relationship between government and society that would make future rebellions impossible, or at least extremely difficult. By disarming the civilian population, he could eliminate the possibility of popular uprisings, while simultaneously clarifying the distinction between the samurai class, which retained the right to bear arms, and everyone else, who were expected to focus on productive rather than military activity. The sword hunt was presented to the public not as a punitive measure, but as a contribution to a great religious project, the construction of a massive statue of Buddha at the Hokoji Temple in Kyoto. The surrendered weapons would be melted down and used in the statue's construction, allowing their former owners to participate in a meritorious act that would benefit all of Japanese society. This framing made the policy more palatable, while reinforcing Hideyoshi's image as a benevolent ruler concerned with spiritual as well as temporal welfare. But the sword hunt was only one component of a broader program of social reorganization that historians call the class separation, or Mibun system. Hideyoshi's reforms divided Japanese society into four distinct classes: samurai, farmers, artisans and merchants, with clearly defined roles, privileges and restrictions for each group. Social mobility between these classes was severely limited, creating a stable hierarchy that would persist for the next 3 centuries. The samurai class retained the exclusive right to bear arms and hold government positions, but they were also required to live in castle towns under the direct supervision of their lords rather than on their own agricultural estates in the countryside. This arrangement gave them privilege and status while ensuring their dependence on the central authority and preventing them from developing independent power bases. Farmers were designated as the second highest class because of their crucial role in food production, but they were prohibited from leaving their villages without permission, and required to devote themselves exclusively to agricultural pursuit. They could not carry weapons, engage in trade, or pursue non-agricultural occupations that might distract them from their primary responsibility of feeding the rest of society. Artisans and merchants, while essential to economic development, were ranked below farmers because their activities were considered less fundamental to social welfare. They were organized into guilds and associations that regulated their activities and ensured their cooperation with government policies, but they were also given considerable freedom to develop their crafts and businesses within established parameters. These reforms had profound implications for Japanese military culture. By restricting warrior status to a hereditary class that was separated from agricultural production, Hideyoshi created a professional military caste that was both more skilled and more dependent on central authority than the part-time soldier farmers who had dominated earlier periods. Samurai could devote themselves entirely to military training and service, but they lost the economic independence that had allowed previous generations of warriors to challenge central authority. The late 16th century, under Hideyoshi's rule, marked what many historians consider the golden age of samurai culture. With the constant warfare of the Sengoku period finally ending, the warrior class could turn its attention from pure survival to the refinement of martial arts, the development of ethical codes, and the creation of cultural forms that would define Japanese civilization for centuries to come. This cultural flowering was made possible by several factors that came together during Hideyoshi's reign. The unification of Japan created a stable political environment where long-term cultural development could flourish. The concentration of samurai in castle towns created communities of warriors who could learn from each other and compete in peaceful pursuits. The end of constant military campaigns allowed time for reflection, study, and artistic creation, and Hideyoshi's own patronage of the arts encouraged cultural innovation and excellence. The martial arts underwent particular development during this period, evolving from practical battlefield techniques into sophisticated systems of physical and spiritual training. Schools of swordsmanship, archery, and other military skills developed distinctive philosophies and methodologies that combined combat effectiveness with character development. Masters like Sukahara Bokudin and Kamiyazumi Nobutsuna created teaching systems that would influence Japanese martial arts for generations. The tea ceremony, which had been developing since the 15th century, reached new heights of refinement under the influence of masters like Senno Rikyu, who became Hideyoshi's tea master and advisor. The ceremony's emphasis on simplicity, restraint, and aesthetic sensitivity provided a counterbalance to the violence and ambition that characterized much of samurai life, offering a path to spiritual development through the mastery of seemingly mundane activity. Poetry, particularly the short form known as haiku, flourished as samurai sought ways to express their inner experiences and observations of the natural world. The discipline required to compose effective haiku paralleled the mental training needed for martial arts, while the form's emphasis on capturing essential truths in minimal words appealed to warriors who valued efficiency and directness. The visual arts also benefited from samurai patronage and participation. Painting styles that combined Chinese influences with distinctively Japanese sensibilities reached new levels of sophistication, while new forms of sculpture, architecture, and decorative arts emerged from the fusion of different regional traditions in Hideyoshi's cosmopolitan court. But perhaps the most significant cultural development of this period was the elaboration of the ethical code that would later be known as Bushido, or the Way of the Warrior. While the basic principles of samurai ethics had been developing for centuries, the late Sengoku period saw their systematization into a coherent philosophy that could guide warrior behavior in peace as well as war. Central to this developing code was the concept of loyalty, which required absolute devotion to one's lord regardless of personal cost or consequence. This principle had been crucial to military effectiveness during the wars of unification, but it took on new meaning in peacetime as a foundation for social stability and political order. The loyal retainer became a cultural ideal that influenced not only samurai behavior, but broader Japanese concepts of proper relationships between superiors and subordinates. Honor was equally important, encompassing both personal integrity and social reputation. Samurai were expected to maintain their honor through adherence to their word, courage in the face of danger, and willingness to accept responsibility for their actions. The ultimate expression of honor was the willingness to commit seppuku rather than live with shame or dishonor, a practice that reached new levels of ritualization during this period. Courage was understood not simply as fearlessness in battle, but as the willingness to do what was right regardless of personal consequences. This included the courage to speak truth to power, to protect the weak, and to maintain one's principles even when it was disadvantageous to do so. Physical bravery remained important, but moral courage was increasingly seen as the higher virtue. Benevolence balanced the warrior's capacity for violence with compassion for others, particularly those who were weaker or less fortunate. This principle encouraged samurai to use their strength to protect rather than to oppress, and to remember their responsibilities to the broader community as well as to their immediate superiors. With Japan unified and domestic resistance eliminated, Hideyoshi turned his attention to a project that would prove to be both his greatest ambition and his ultimate failure, the conquest of Korea, and, through it, the Chinese Empire itself. This enterprise, known in Japanese history as the Korean Invasions or Hideyoshi's Korean War, would test the limits of Japanese military power and ultimately demonstrate the dangers of overextending even the most successful military machine. Hideyoshi's decision to invade Korea was motivated by several factors that seemed logical from his perspective, but proved to be based on fundamental miscalculations. Domestically, he faced the problem of what to do with the large numbers of experienced warriors who had been displaced by the end of civil war. These men were trained for nothing but fighting, and their idleness posed a potential threat to domestic stability. Foreign conquest would provide them with employment while channeling their energies away from potentially rebellious activities. Strategically, Hideyoshi believed that Japan's security required control of the Korean peninsula, which could serve as a buffer against potential Chinese aggression and a base for further expansion into mainland Asia. He was influenced by reports from Japanese traders and pirates who had operated in Korean waters, and who had given him an exaggerated impression of Korea's military weakness and political divisions. Perhaps most importantly, Hideyoshi was driven by a vision of himself as a world conqueror comparable to Alexander the Great or Genghis Khan. Having unified Japan against seemingly impossible odds, he believed that his military innovations and leadership abilities could overcome any obstacle. The conquest of Korea would be merely the first step toward the ultimate goal of ruling China, the greatest empire in the world. The invasion force that Hideyoshi assembled in 1592 was the largest and most sophisticated expeditionary army in Japanese history to that point. Over 150,000 men were transported across the Korea Strait in a massive logistical operation that demonstrated Japanese capabilities in naval organization and amphibious warfare. The army included not only experienced samurai warriors, but also large numbers of Ashigari foot soldiers armed with the most advanced firearms available, as well as specialists in siege warfare, engineering, and military administration. The initial phase of the invasion was brilliantly successful, seeming to confirm Hideyoshi's optimistic predictions. Japanese forces landed at Busan and rapidly advanced northward, capturing Seoul within just 3 weeks and reaching the Chinese border within 2 months. Korean armies, trained in outdated tactics and demoralized by political corruption, proved unable to resist the disciplined Japanese forces and their superior weapons. But early success masked fundamental problems that would ultimately doom the entire enterprise. Japanese supply lines across the Korea Strait were vulnerable to attack by Korean naval forces, particularly the innovative turtle ships commanded by Admiral Yi Sun-sin, which used armor plating and cannon armament to devastate Japanese transport vessels. Korean resistance, initially scattered and ineffective, gradually coalesced into a powerful guerrilla movement that made Japanese occupation of conquered territory extremely difficult. Most critically, Chinese intervention transformed what Hideyoshi had expected to be a relatively easy conquest into a prolonged war against one of the world's most powerful empires. Chinese armies were larger, better supplied, and more experienced in the kind of continental warfare that characterized the Korean theater. They also brought military technologies, particularly artillery, that negated many of the advantages that Japanese forces had enjoyed against purely Korean opposition. The war that developed was unlike anything in previous Japanese experience. Instead of the brief, decisive campaigns that had characterized the unification of Japan, the Korean conflict became a grinding war of attrition, fought across vast distances, with extended supply lines and constantly shifting fronts. Japanese forces found themselves trapped in a hostile country where every civilian was a potential enemy, dependent on precarious sea communications that were constantly under attack. Japanese military culture, which had evolved during the relatively limited conflicts of the Sengoku period, proved poorly adapted to this new kind of warfare. Samurai expectations of individual combat and personal glory were frustrated by the impersonal nature of artillery bombardments and mass infantry engagement. The emphasis on quick, decisive action that had served Hideyoshi so well in Japan became a liability in a conflict that required patience, persistence, and the ability to sustain heavy casualties over extended periods. By 1598, it had become clear that Hideyoshi's Korean adventure was not only failing to achieve its objectives but was actually weakening Japan's position in East Asia. The enormous costs of maintaining large armies overseas were straining the Japanese economy, while the prolonged absence of so many warriors was creating domestic problems that threatened the stability of Hideyoshi's regime. More fundamentally, the Korean War had revealed the limitations of the military system that Hideyoshi had created for the unification of Japan. Tactics that had been devastatingly effective against Japanese castle towns and traditional samurai armies proved inadequate against Chinese artillery and Korean guerrillas. The logistical systems that had supported campaigns within Japan could not reliably supply forces operating hundreds of miles across hostile waters. The psychological advantages that had made many of Hideyoshi's domestic victories possible were meaningless against enemies who had no reason to be impressed by Japanese reputation or accomplishment. Hideyoshi himself, now in his 60s and suffering from declining health, began to show signs of the megalomania that often afflicts successful leaders who have never experienced significant failure. His demands for absolute obedience became more extreme, his treatment of subordinates more arbitrary, and his strategic thinking more detached from practical reality. The man who had once been famous for his ability to understand and motivate others was becoming isolated from the very people whose loyalty and competence his success depended upon. The death of Hideyoshi on September 18, 1598, brought an immediate end to the Korean invasions as his successors recalled the Japanese armies to deal with the succession crisis that his death precipitated, but the damage had already been done. The war had cost hundreds of thousands of lives, depleted Japan's treasury, and created lasting enmity between Japan and its continental neighbors that would influence East Asian politics for centuries. Perhaps more importantly for the development of Japanese culture, the Korean War had demonstrated the dangers of unchecked ambition and the importance of understanding one's limitations. The failure of Hideyoshi's continental adventure would influence Japanese strategic thinking for generations, contributing to the isolationist policies that would characterize the following Edo period. For the samurai class, the Korean War represented both the culmination and the beginning of the end of their military importance. Never again would Japanese armies fight on such a scale or with such advanced weaponry. Never again would samurai face enemies who possessed comparable military technology and training. The skills and experiences gained in Korea would be preserved and refined during the peaceful Edo period, but they would never again be tested in large-scale warfare. The failure in Korea also marked the end of the age of military innovation that had characterized the late Sengoku period. The rapid adoption of new weapons and tactics that had driven Japanese military development since Nobunaga's time would give way to a more conservative approach that emphasized perfection of existing techniques, rather than experimentation with new ones. This would have profound implications for Japan's ability to respond to foreign challenges in later centuries. As Hideyoshi lay dying in 1598, he was acutely aware that his death would create a power vacuum that could easily tear apart the unified Japan he had worked so hard to create. His heir Hideyori was only 5 years old, far too young to exercise real authority or command the loyalty of the great daimyo, who controlled the country's military forces. To prevent the kind of succession crisis that had followed Nobunaga's death, Hideyoshi created a council of 5 great lords, the Go-Tairo, who would jointly govern Japan until Hideyori came of age. The most powerful member of this council was Tokugawa Ieyasu, a man who had been both ally and rival to Hideyoshi for decades, and who possessed the experience, resources, and cunning necessary to seize control of the entire system. Ieyasu was in many ways the opposite of Hideyoshi. Where the latter had been impulsive and charismatic, Ieyasu was patient and calculating. Where Hideyoshi had relied on brilliant improvisation, Ieyasu preferred careful planning and systematic preparation. Tokugawa Ieyasu was born in 1543 as Matsudaira Takechio, the son of a minor daimyo in Mikawa province who was caught between the expanding powers of the Oda and the Imagawa. His childhood was marked by the kind of political uncertainty that characterized the Sengoku period. He was held as a hostage by different factions, saw his father assassinated by rivals, and learned early that survival required adaptability, patience, and the ability to judge when to fight and when to submit. These early experiences shaped Ieyasu's approach to politics and warfare in fundamental ways. Unlike leaders who relied primarily on personal charisma or military brilliance, Ieyasu understood that lasting success required the creation of institutional structures that could survive the death or defeat of any individual. He was less interested in dramatic victories than in sustainable advantages, less concerned with immediate gratification than with long-term positioning. Ieyasu's rise to prominence had been gradual but relentless. He had allied himself with Nobunaga early in his career, contributing to the victory at Okehazama and supporting the Oda through most of their major campaigns. When Hideyoshi emerged as Nobunaga's successor, Ieyasu had initially resisted but eventually submitted, recognizing that continued opposition would be futile. His cooperation with Hideyoshi's unification campaigns had been rewarded with substantial territorial grants in the Kanto region, making him one of the wealthiest and most powerful daimyo in Japan. But throughout this period, Ieyasu had been building the foundations for his own eventual supremacy. His domain in the Kanto was efficiently administered, economically productive, and strategically located to control access to the northern provinces. His retainers were fanatically loyal, bound to him by generations of shared struggle and mutual benefit. His military forces were well-trained, well-equipped, and experienced in the kind of large-scale warfare that would be necessary to challenge other great powers. Most importantly, Ieyasu had cultivated relationships with other daimyo, who were dissatisfied with various aspects of Hideyoshi's policies, or worried about their own positions in the post-Hideyoshi order. These potential allies included both traditional rivals of the Toyotomi and ambitious leaders who saw opportunity in the coming succession crisis. By 1600, Ieyasu had assembled a coalition that was arguably stronger than the forces loyal to Hideyoshi and his region. The crisis that would determine Japan's future came to a head over the question of how to punish Uesugi Kagekatsu, a powerful northern daimyo who had allegedly been preparing for rebellion against the Toyotomi government. When Ieyasu led an army north to deal with this threat, his enemies saw an opportunity to eliminate him while he was far from his power base and engaged with other enemies. The leader of the anti-Tokugawa coalition was Ishida Mitsunari, a brilliant administrator who had been one of Hideyoshi's most trusted retainers, but who lacked the military experience and charismatic leadership necessary to unite the diverse factions opposed to Ieyasu. Mitsunari's strategy was to use Ieyasu's absence to seize control of the strategic heartland of Japan, then force the Tokugawa to fight their way back from a position of disadvantage. But Ieyasu had anticipated this possibility and prepared accordingly. Rather than becoming trapped in the north, he quickly concluded his business with the Uesugi and marched his army back toward the capital region, gathering additional forces and allies along the way. His rapid response caught his enemies off guard and forced them to fight the decisive battle on terms that favored his superior organization and leadership. The Battle of Sekihara, fought on October 15, 1600, was the most decisive engagement in Japanese history, determining not only who would rule the country, but what kind of society Japan would become for the next 2.5 centuries. The battle lasted only 6 hours, but its consequences would reshape every aspect of Japanese life from politics and economics to culture and philosophy. The battlefield itself was strategically significant, located in a valley that controlled the main route between eastern and western Japan. Whoever controlled Sekihara could dominate communications and transportation between the country's 2 major population centers, making it an ideal location for a decisive confrontation between rival coalitions seeking to control all of Japan. Ieyasu's army, known as the Eastern Army, numbered approximately 75,000 men and included some of the most experienced and disciplined forces in Japan. These troops had been fighting together for years under Ieyasu's leadership, and they possessed the kind of unit cohesion and tactical coordination that came from shared experience and mutual trust. Their equipment was standardized and well maintained, their supply systems were efficient, and their commanders understood both Ieyasu's strategic vision and their own roles in achieving it. The Western Army, nominally commanded by Mori Teramoto, but actually led by Yoshida Mitsunari, was larger in numbers but weaker in cohesion and leadership. Many of its component units had been assembled hastily from different domains with varying levels of training, equipment and motivation. Some commanders were genuinely committed to the Toyotomi cause, but others were participating reluctantly or had already been secretly negotiating with Ieyasu for favorable treatment in case of defeat. The battle began before dawn with preliminary skirmishing between advance forces, but the main engagement developed as the morning mist lifted to reveal the two armies deployed on opposite sides of the valley. Ieyasu had positioned his forces to take advantage of the terrain, with his strongest units controlling the high ground and his reserves positioned to respond to developments anywhere along the line. The critical moment came when Tokugawa Hideyoshi, commanding a large contingent of the Western Army, positioned on a hill overlooking the battlefield, failed to attack Ieyasu's flank as planned. Hideyoshi had been secretly negotiating with the Tokugawa and chose this moment to reveal his true allegiance, keeping his forces neutral while the battle raged below. His betrayal exposed other Western Army units to devastating flank attacks, and created a psychological shock that rippled throughout Mitsunari's coalition. Other commanders followed Hideyoshi's example, either switching sides outright or withdrawing their forces from the battle. Within hours, what had appeared to be a closely matched contest had become a rout, with Western Army units fleeing in disorder while Ieyasu's disciplined forces pursued and captured those who could not escape quickly enough. Mitsunari himself was captured 3 days after the battle and executed, along with several other leaders who had remained loyal to the Toyotomi cause. But Ieyasu's treatment of defeated enemies was generally magnanimous, reflecting his understanding that lasting victory required reconciliation as well as conquest. Many former opponents were allowed to retain their domains on condition of submission, while others were relocated to different territories where they could be more easily supervised. The victory at Sekigahara made Ieyasu the undisputed master of Japan, but it also presented him with challenges that neither Nobunaga nor Hideyoshi had fully solved: how to create political institutions that could maintain unity without requiring constant military intervention, and how to manage a warrior class that was no longer needed for constant warfare but was too powerful and numerous to simply eliminate. Ieyasu's approach to governing unified Japan reflected the lessons he had learned from observing the successes and failures of his predecessors. Unlike Nobunaga, who had relied primarily on force and intimidation, or Hideyoshi, who had depended heavily on personal charisma and dramatic gestures, Ieyasu focused on creating institutional structures that could function effectively regardless of the qualities of individual leaders. The foundation of the Tokugawa system was the principle of controlled decentralization, which allowed regional daimyo to maintain their domains and traditional authority, while ensuring their ultimate dependence on the central government. This arrangement satisfied the desire for local autonomy that had been one of the driving forces behind centuries of civil war, while creating mechanisms that made effective rebellion virtually impossible. The key to this system was Ieyasu's refinement of the Sankin Kotai system that Hideyoshi had begun to develop. Under the Tokugawa version, all daimyo were required to maintain residences in Edo and to spend alternate years in the capital, under the shogun's direct supervision. When they returned to their domains, they had to leave their wives and children in Edo as hostages, ensuring their continued loyalty and providing the government with detailed intelligence about conditions in every part of the country. This system served multiple purposes beyond simple control. The constant movement of daimyo and their retinues between their domains and the capital created a massive transportation and hospitality industry that stimulated economic development throughout Japan. The concentration of the wealthy and powerful in Edo for half of each year made the city a center of cultural innovation and artistic achievement that influenced the entire country. Most importantly, the system created personal relationships and shared experiences among the ruling class that helped overcome regional differences and create a sense of national identity. Ieyasu also revolutionized the economic foundations of political power, in ways that made his system more stable than previous arrangements. Traditional Japanese governance had been based on control of agricultural land, which meant that political power was dispersed among thousands of local landholders who could potentially challenge central authority. The Tokugawa system concentrated control of the most productive agricultural regions in the hands of the shogun's direct retainers, while requiring all daimyo to depend on the central government for access to commercial markets and advanced technologies. The creation of a unified currency system, standardized weights and measures, and coordinated transportation networks made regional economic independence increasingly impractical, while generating wealth that could be used to support the military and administrative apparatus needed to maintain order. Edo became not only the political capital, but also the commercial and financial center of Japan, controlling trade routes and credit systems that reached into every corner of the country. Perhaps most importantly, Ieyasu created new roles for the samurai class that channeled their energies into productive rather than destructive activity. Instead of spending their time fighting each other, samurai were encouraged to become administrators, scholars, teachers, and cultural leaders who contributed to social development rather than social disruption. The martial arts continued to be practiced and refined, but as forms of character development and cultural expression rather than preparation for actual warfare. This transformation of samurai culture was facilitated by the development of new educational institutions and cultural practices that gave warriors meaningful alternatives to military careers. Schools of Confucian philosophy provided intellectual frameworks for understanding governance and social responsibility. Academies of martial arts offered ways to maintain warrior identity while developing self-discipline and spiritual insight. Literary and artistic pursuits became acceptable outlets for competitive instincts and desires for recognition and achievement. Despite the completeness of his victory at Sekigahara and the effectiveness of his governmental reforms, Ieyasu understood that his position would never be entirely secure, as long as Hideyoshi's son Hideyori remained alive and capable of serving as a rallying point for opposition to Tokugawa rule. The young man, now grown to adulthood, controlled the massive fortress of Osaka Castle and commanded the loyalty of thousands of masterless samurai, ronin, who had been displaced by the end of the civil wars. The situation was complicated by the fact that Hideyori had married Ieyasu's granddaughter, creating family ties that made direct action against him politically difficult. Moreover, Hideyori had done nothing overtly rebellious that would justify military action against him. He simply existed as a potential alternative to Tokugawa authority, which was enough to make him dangerous in Ieyasu's carefully calculated political system. The crisis that would finally resolve this situation began in 1614, over a seemingly minor dispute about an inscription on a temple bell that Hideyori had donated to a Buddhist temple. The inscription included characters that could be interpreted as a curse against the Tokugawa, providing Ieyasu with the excuse he needed to demand an explanation, and ultimately to declare Hideyori in rebellion when he failed to provide satisfactory answers. The siege that followed, known as the Winter Campaign of 1614–1615, would be the last great military engagement of the samurai age and a demonstration of how warfare had evolved since the earlier periods of constant conflict. Osaka Castle was the strongest fortress in Japan, protected by multiple rings of fortifications and garrisoned by experienced warriors who had little to lose and everything to gain from a successful defense. Ieyasu's approach to reducing this stronghold reflected his characteristic combination of overwhelming force and patient strategy. Rather than attempting costly direct assaults, he surrounded the castle with an army of over 150,000 men, and began a systematic bombardment using the most advanced artillery available. European-style cannon, many of them operated by foreign experts, pounded the fortress walls day and night, creating psychological as well as physical damage. The defenders, led by legendary warriors like Sanada Yukimura and Goto Mototsugu, fought with the kind of desperate courage that had characterized samurai warfare for centuries. They launched daring sorties against the besieging forces, employed innovative defensive techniques, and demonstrated the martial skills that had made Japanese warriors feared throughout East Asia. But their individual heroism could not overcome the systematic application of superior resources and technology. The siege was temporarily resolved by a truce that allowed Ieyasu to inspect the castle's defenses and to negotiate terms for a peaceful settlement. But the peace was short-lived, as both sides used the interval to prepare for renewed fighting. When hostilities resumed in the summer campaign of 1615, Ieyasu's forces had been reinforced and resupplied while the defenders had been weakened by disease, desertion, and the psychological strain of prolonged siege. The final assault on Osaka Castle was more than just a military operation. It was a symbolic demonstration that the age of samurai independence had ended forever. The fall of the castle on June 4, 1615 was followed by the deaths of Hideyoshi and his mother, eliminating the last potential challenge to Tokugawa authority. The thousands of ronin who had defended the castle were either killed in the fighting or executed afterward, removing a potentially dangerous element from Japanese society. The end of the Osaka campaigns marked the beginning of a new era in Japanese history, characterized by peace, stability, and the gradual transformation of warrior culture from a military necessity into a cultural tradition. The samurai class remained at the top of the social hierarchy, but their role changed fundamentally from fighters to administrators, scholars, and cultural leaders. This transformation was neither immediate nor easy. Many samurai struggled to adapt to a world where their traditional skills were no longer needed, and their social position depended on their ability to serve the state in peaceful, rather than martial capacities. The romantic ideal of the warrior remained powerful, but it had to be reconciled with the practical realities of governing a unified nation at peace. The solution that emerged was the development of Bushido as a comprehensive ethical and philosophical system that could guide samurai behavior in peacetime while preserving the essential elements of warrior identity. This code emphasized loyalty, honor, courage, and self-discipline, but it redefined these virtues in ways that made them applicable to civilian administration rather than military service. Loyalty was no longer simply a matter of following one's lord into battle, but of faithful service in whatever capacity the state required. Honor became associated with fulfilling one's duties rather than achieving military glory. Courage was redefined to include the moral bravery needed to speak truth to power, and to make difficult decisions for the greater good. Self-discipline was channeled into the mastery of cultural arts and scholarly pursuits rather than purely martial skill. The martial arts themselves underwent a similar transformation, evolving from practical combat training into sophisticated systems of physical and spiritual development. Schools of swordsmanship, archery, and other warrior skills became focused on character building rather than battlefield effectiveness, developing elaborate philosophical frameworks that justified their continued practice in peacetime. This evolution was exemplified by the career of Miyamoto Musashi, perhaps the most famous swordsman in Japanese history, whose life spanned the transition from the Sengoku period to the early Edo era. Musashi's early career was spent in actual combat, participating in battles and duels where lives were literally at stake, but his later years were devoted to developing a philosophical understanding of swordsmanship that emphasized mental discipline and spiritual insight over mere technical proficiency. Musashi's Book of Five Rings, written toward the end of his life, reflects this transformation of martial arts from practical to philosophical pursuit. While it contains detailed technical instruction about sword fighting, it is equally concerned with the mental and spiritual aspects of warrior training and their application to all areas of life. Musashi's approach to swordsmanship became a model for how traditional warrior skills could be preserved and refined even in the absence of actual warfare. Similar developments occurred in other areas of samurai culture. Poetry, calligraphy, and other artistic pursuits became not just hobbies, but essential elements of warrior education. The tea ceremony, which had been popularized during Hideyoshi's time, became a central part of samurai culture, providing a framework for developing aesthetic sensitivity and social grace. Even flower arrangement and garden design became vehicles for expressing warrior ideals in peaceful context. As the 17th century progressed, and memories of actual warfare faded. The samurai class faced the challenge of maintaining their relevance and identity in a society that no longer needed their military services. The solution they developed was to become the guardians of Japanese cultural tradition and the embodiment of national values that transcended their original military function. This cultural role became increasingly important as Japan entered a period of voluntary isolation from the outside world. The Tokugawa government's decision to limit foreign contact and prohibit most international travel meant that Japanese society would develop along its own lines without significant external influence for over 2 centuries. In this context, the samurai became the custodians of a distinctively Japanese way of life that preserved ancient traditions while adapting them to contemporary needs. The educational system that developed during the Edo period reflected this new role for the warrior class. Samurai children were required to study not only martial arts but also classical literature, Confucian philosophy, history, and various cultural arts. The goal was to produce not just competent administrators, but cultivated individuals who could serve as models of proper behavior for the rest of society. This educational emphasis had profound effects on Japanese intellectual and cultural development. The high literacy rates among the samurai class, combined with their leisure time and social status, made them the primary audience for a flourishing publishing industry that produced everything from serious philosophical works to popular entertainment. The distinctive aesthetic sensibilities that would characterize Japanese culture in later periods were largely developed by samurai artists, writers, and thinkers during this peaceful era. The political stability that characterized most of the Edo period also allowed for unprecedented economic development and social sophistication. Cities grew larger and more prosperous, trade networks became more extensive and efficient, and new industries developed to serve the needs of an increasingly complex society. The samurai class, while maintaining their social superiority, had to learn to coexist with wealthy merchants and skilled artisans whose economic importance often exceeded their own. This social evolution created tensions that would eventually contribute to the transformation of Japanese society in the 90s. The rigid class system that had been established during the early Tokugawa period became increasingly difficult to maintain as economic realities changed and new ideas about social organization emerged. But it also created a stable foundation for development that allowed Japan to modernize rapidly when external pressures finally forced the country to abandon its isolation. The military traditions that had been preserved and refined during the peaceful Edo period would prove crucial when Japan once again faced external threats in the mid-90s. While samurai warfare had not been tested in actual combat for generations, the discipline, organization, and cultural unity that had been maintained through the martial arts and Bushido philosophy provided a foundation for rapid military modernization when it became necessary. Perhaps most importantly, the samurai legacy included a concept of service to the state and dedication to excellence that would influence Japanese development long after the class system itself had been abolished. The idea that individuals should subordinate their personal interests to the welfare of the community, that technical mastery should be pursued for its own sake as well as for practical benefit, and that honor and duty were more important than material success would become defining characteristics of modern Japanese culture. As the Edo period drew to a close in the mid-19th century, the samurai class faced its greatest challenge since the end of the Sengoku Wars: how to respond to the arrival of foreign powers with superior military technology and different concepts of international relations. The comfortable isolation that had allowed Japanese society to develop along its own lines for over 2 centuries was no longer sustainable in a world where European and American powers were expanding their influence throughout Asia. The crisis that would ultimately transform Japan began with the arrival of Commodore Matthew Perry's black ships in 1853, demanding that Japan open its ports to foreign trade and diplomatic relations. The superior firepower of Perry's steam-powered warships demonstrated that Japan's traditional military capabilities were obsolete, while his diplomatic demands challenged the basic assumptions of the Tokugawa political system. The samurai response to this crisis reflected both the strengths and limitations of their cultural development during the peaceful Edo period. On one hand, their education in Confucian philosophy and classical literature had given them sophisticated frameworks for understanding political and social issues. Their training in martial arts had maintained habits of discipline and dedication that could be applied to new challenges. Their tradition of loyal service provided a foundation for coordinated action in times of crisis. But the very success of the Tokugawa system in maintaining peace had also created weaknesses that became apparent when serious challenges emerged. Generations of samurai had grown up without any experience of actual warfare or exposure to foreign ideas and technologies. The rigid social hierarchy that had maintained stability for centuries now hindered rapid adaptation to changing circumstances. The isolation that had preserved Japanese cultural traditions had also prevented the country from keeping pace with developments in the outside world. The debates that raged among samurai leaders during the 1850s and 1880s, some argued for maintaining traditional isolation and relying on improved versions of existing military technologies to resist foreign pressure. Others advocated for selective adoption of Western innovations while preserving essential elements of Japanese culture and political structure. Still others called for fundamental reform that would transform Japan into a modern state capable of competing with European powers on equal terms. The resolution of these debates came through a combination of political revolution and cultural evolution that preserved essential elements of samurai tradition while adapting them to the requirements of a modern industrial state. The Meiji Restoration of 1868 formally ended the Tokugawa shogunate and restored imperial rule, but the real transformation occurred in the following decades, as Japan rapidly modernized its military economy and political institutions. Many of the leaders of this modernization effort were samurai who applied their traditional values of loyalty, discipline, and service to the task of creating a new Japan that could stand as an equal among the world's great powers. The educational system they created combined Western scientific and technical knowledge with Japanese moral and cultural traditions. The military forces they organized used European weapons and tactics, but maintained distinctively Japanese concepts of honor and duty. The industrial development that transformed Japan during the late 19th and early 20th centuries was guided by principles that reflected samurai influence, emphasis on technical excellence, dedication to continuous improvement, subordination of individual interests to collective goals, and commitment to surpassing foreign competitors through superior effort and organization. Even as the formal samurai class was abolished and the legal privileges of warrior status were eliminated, the cultural values and behavioral patterns that had been developed during centuries of samurai rule continued to influence Japanese society. The concept of Bushido was redefined and popularized as a national ethic that applied to all citizens rather than just the warrior class. The martial arts became vehicles for character development, available to anyone willing to undergo the necessary training and discipline. The ultimate test of these evolved samurai traditions came during the Pacific War of 1941–1945, when Japan's military and civilian leaders attempted to apply traditional concepts of honor, loyalty, and sacrifice to the challenges of modern industrial warfare. The results demonstrated both the enduring power and the tragic limitations of warrior culture when applied to conflicts that exceeded the scale and complexity of traditional samurai warfare. The defeat of 1945 forced another fundamental re-evaluation of samurai traditions and their relevance to modern Japanese society. But rather than abandoning these traditions entirely, post-war Japan found new ways to apply samurai values to peaceful pursuits. Economic development, technological innovation, international cooperation, and cultural achievement. The discipline and dedication that had once been channeled into martial pursuits were redirected toward building a prosperous, peaceful, and internationally respected society. Today, more than 4 centuries after the end of the Sengoku period, the influence of samurai culture remains visible throughout Japanese society. The martial arts continue to attract practitioners worldwide who seek not just physical training but spiritual and character development. The aesthetic principles developed by samurai artists and philosophers continue to influence Japanese design, architecture, and craftsmanship. The organizational methods and management philosophies that enabled samurai leaders to govern effectively have been adapted to modern business and institutional contexts. Perhaps most importantly, the samurai legacy includes a demonstration that warrior traditions can evolve and adapt to changing circumstances while preserving their essential values and purpose. The path from medieval battlefield to the modern boardroom may seem impossibly distant, but it reflects the same fundamental commitment to excellence, service, and continuous self-improvement that characterized the greatest samurai leaders of the Sengoku period. The story of the samurai is ultimately the story of how human beings can transform themselves and their societies through discipline, dedication, and willingness to adapt to new challenges, while maintaining connection to their fundamental values and purpose. In this sense, the age of the samurai never truly ended. It simply evolved into new forms that continue to influence and inspire people around the world who seek to combine strength with wisdom, power with responsibility, and individual excellence with service to the greater. The early decades of the 17th century marked the beginning of what historians now recognize as the golden age of samurai culture. With the establishment of the Tokugawa shogunate and the end of large-scale warfare, the warrior class found itself in the unprecedented position of having both the leisure and the security necessary to refine their martial arts, philosophical understanding, and cultural achievements to levels that had never before been possible. This transformation was not immediate or without conflict. Many samurai struggled to find meaning and purpose in a world where their traditional military skills were no longer needed for survival or advancement. The psychological adjustment from a life of constant danger and action to one of administrative routine and cultural refinement proved difficult for warriors who had been raised on stories of battlefield glory and heroic death. The solution that emerged was the development of what scholars call the way of the warrior in peacetime, a comprehensive reinterpretation of Bushido that maintained the essential elements of samurai identity while adapting them to the requirements of a unified, peaceful society. This new understanding of warrior culture emphasized personal cultivation, social responsibility, and spiritual development as the highest expressions of martial virtue. Central to this transformation was the recognition that true mastery of the martial arts required not just physical skill, but deep understanding of the philosophical and spiritual principles that underlay effective action. The greatest swordsmen of the early Edo period were not necessarily the strongest or fastest fighters, but those who had achieved a level of mental clarity and emotional balance that allowed them to respond appropriately to any situation. This emphasis on internal development led to an explosion of innovation in martial arts pedagogy and philosophy. Traditional fighting techniques were analyzed, systematized, and refined until they became vehicles for comprehensive personal development, rather than simply methods of defeating enemies. Schools of swordsmanship, archery, and other martial disciplines developed elaborate curricula that included meditation, moral instruction, and aesthetic training alongside technical practice. The most famous example of this evolution was the development of kendo, the way of the sword, which transformed swordsmanship from a battlefield skill into a form of moving meditation that could be practiced safely and beneficially throughout one's lifetime. Practitioners wore protective armor and used bamboo swords instead of steel blades, allowing for realistic practice without the risk of serious injury or death that had characterized earlier training methods. Similar developments occurred in other martial arts. Kyudo, the way of the bow, evolved from military archery into a precise ritual that emphasized mental discipline and spiritual purification as much as accuracy. Jujutsu schools developed increasingly sophisticated techniques for unarmed combat, while simultaneously creating philosophical frameworks that justified their practice as methods of character development, rather than simply ways of defeating opponents. The theoretical foundations for these developments were provided by a remarkable group of martial artists and philosophers who combined practical expertise with scholarly learning and spiritual insight. These masters created the intellectual framework that would govern samurai education and cultural development for the next 2 centuries, establishing principles and practices that continue to influence martial arts training throughout the world. Among all the great masters of the early Edo period, none has had a more lasting influence on martial arts and warrior philosophy than Miyamoto Musashi, a swordsman whose life bridged the transition from the age of warfare to the age of peace, and whose writings continue to influence military strategists, business leaders, and spiritual seekers around the world. Musashi was born during the final decades of the Sengoku period, when warfare was still common and martial skills were matters of life and death rather than cultural refinement. His early years were spent in actual combat, participating in battles where defeat meant death, and victory required not just skill, but also the kind of ruthless determination that characterized the greatest warriors of his age. According to his own account, Musashi fought his first duel at the age of 13, and participated in 6 major battles during his youth, including the climactic Battle of Sekigahara. These experiences gave him a practical understanding of combat that was unmatched by later generations of peacetime samurai, and they formed the foundation for the revolutionary approach to martial arts that he would develop during his later years. What set Musashi apart from other accomplished swordsmen was his systematic approach to understanding and improving his art. Rather than simply relying on the techniques he had learned from established schools, he constantly experimented with new methods, analyzed the strengths and weaknesses of different approaches, and sought to develop a comprehensive system that could be applied to any combat situation. This experimental attitude led Musashi to develop what he called Naitanichi-Ru, the 2 heavens as one school, which emphasized the use of 2 swords simultaneously, rather than the single long sword that was traditional in most Japanese martial arts. His technique was based on the insight that fighting with 2 weapons required a different kind of mental coordination and physical balance that could enhance overall combat effectiveness. But Musashi's most significant contribution to martial arts was not any particular technique but his systematic analysis of the mental and spiritual aspects of combat. He understood that physical skill alone was insufficient for consistent success, and that true mastery required the development of what he called the void, a state of mental clarity and emotional detachment that allowed the warrior to respond spontaneously and appropriately to any situation. This understanding was developed through decades of intense practice and philosophical reflection, culminating in the composition of Go-Rin no Sha, one of the most influential works on strategy and personal development ever written. The book, completed shortly before Musashi's death in 1645, presents his mature understanding of martial arts as a comprehensive approach to life that applies to all forms of conflict and competition. The 5 rings of the title refer to different aspects of strategic thinking and personal development: earth, water, fire, wind, and void. Each ring represents both a stage in the development of martial expertise and a way of understanding reality that has applications far beyond the battlefield. Musashi's approach to training was as revolutionary as his philosophy. Unlike traditional martial arts schools which emphasized the repetition of established forms and techniques, Musashi encouraged his students to experiment, adapt, and develop their own understanding through direct experience. He believed that true learning came from facing real challenges, rather than simply memorizing predetermined responses. This emphasis on practical experience led Musashi to seek out duels with other masters throughout Japan, not out of aggression or desire for fame, but as a way of testing and refining his understanding. According to his own count, he fought over 60 duels during his lifetime and was never defeated, a record that established his reputation as the greatest swordsman of his generation. But perhaps Musashi's most famous duel was his final one, fought against Sashiki. Kojiro was considered one of the finest swordsmen in Japan, famous for his technique with the long sword and his almost supernatural speed and precision. The duel was as much a philosophical confrontation as a physical one, pitting Musashi's adaptive experimental approach against Kojiro's perfected traditional technique. Musashi's victory in this duel was achieved not through superior swordsmanship in the conventional sense, but through psychological warfare and strategic thinking that demonstrated the principles he had been developing throughout his career. He arrived late for the appointed time, disrupting Kojiro's mental preparation, and he carved his weapon from a boat oar during the journey to the island, showing his ability to adapt his techniques to whatever the materials were available. The actual combat lasted only moments, but it demonstrated the effectiveness of Musashi's approach to martial arts as a comprehensive system of strategy and mental development rather than simply a collection of fighting techniques. His victory established his reputation as the supreme martial artist of his era and validated the philosophical approach that he had been developing. While Musashi represented the evolution of martial arts towards systematic analysis and philosophical sophistication, another crucial development in Edo period samurai culture was the integration of aesthetic pursuits with warrior training. The most important example of this integration was the relationship between the tea ceremony and Bushido, which created new forms of cultural expression that embodied samurai values while providing alternatives to the violence that had characterized earlier warrior culture. The tea ceremony had been developing since the 15th century, but it reached its mature form during the late 16th century under the influence of masters like Sen no Rikyu, who served as tea master to both Nobunaga and Hideyoshi. Rikyu's approach to tea emphasized simplicity, restraint, and attention to subtle details that reflected deeper philosophical and spiritual principles. For the samurai class, the tea ceremony provided a way of cultivating sensitivity and refinement that balanced the harsh realities of warrior life. The ceremony's emphasis on precise movements, aesthetic awareness, and respect to interaction with others offered a counterpoint to the violence and aggression that were necessary for military success. Participation in tea gatherings allowed warriors to develop aspects of their personality that had no outlet in battlefield activities, but the relationship between tea and Bushido went deeper than simple contrast or compensation. Both traditions emphasized the importance of discipline, attention to detail, and mastery through practice. Both valued simplicity over ostentation and substance over appearance. Both recognized that true understanding came through direct experience rather than intellectual analysis, and both understood that the highest achievements required the transcendence of ego and personal desire in service of larger principles. The integration of these traditions created new forms of samurai culture that were distinctively Japanese and profoundly influential in shaping the aesthetic sensibilities that would characterize Japanese civilization for centuries to come. Warriors who had mastered both the sword and the tea ceremony developed a kind of cultural sophistication that was unmatched anywhere in the world, combining martial prowess with artistic sensitivity in ways that elevated both pursuits. This integration was exemplified by figures like Furuto Oribe, a samurai who served under both Nobunaga and Hideyoshi while simultaneously becoming one of the most influential tea masters of his generation. Oribe's approach to tea ceremony incorporated elements of warrior culture, including a preference for bold, irregular forms that reflected the dynamism and unpredictability of military life. The aesthetic principles that emerged from this fusion of martial and cultural traditions would influence all aspects of Japanese art and design. The concept of wabi-sabi, which finds beauty in imperfection and impermanence, reflected the warrior's awareness of the fragility of life and the importance of appreciating momentary experience. The emphasis on naturalness and spontaneity balanced the formal discipline required for martial training with an appreciation for organic development and individual expression. Garden design became another important area where samurai cultural values were expressed through aesthetic means. The great gardens of the Edo period were not simply decorative landscapes but sophisticated compositions that embodied philosophical principles and provided settings for contemplation and spiritual development. The careful placement of rocks, water features, and plants created environments that encouraged the kind of mental clarity and emotional balance that were essential for both martial arts and personal cultivation. Architecture also reflected the influence of samurai values, with an emphasis on functionality, durability, and harmonious integration with natural surroundings. The great castles of the Edo period combined military necessity with aesthetic sophistication, creating structures that were both practically effective and visually impressive. The residential architecture favored by the samurai class emphasized simplicity and flexibility, with spaces that could be adapted to different purposes depending on circumstance. The peaceful conditions of the Edo period created unprecedented opportunities for intellectual development among the samurai class, leading to a flowering of philosophical and scholarly activity that would profoundly influence Japanese thought for centuries to come. Unlike their predecessors, who had been primarily concerned with immediate survival and military effectiveness, Edo period samurai had the leisure and security necessary for deep study and systematic reflection on fundamental questions about human nature, social organization, and the meaning of existence. The dominant intellectual framework for this development was Neo-Confucianism, a sophisticated philosophical system that had been developed in China during the Song dynasty and imported to Japan during the early Tokugawa period. Neo-Confucianism offered samurai thinkers a comprehensive worldview that could integrate practical concerns about governance and social order with deeper questions about ethics, metaphysics, and spiritual development. The most influential figure in the development of Japanese Neo-Confucianism was Hayashi Reizan, a scholar who served as advisor to the first 4 Tokugawa shoguns and established the intellectual foundations for samurai education throughout the Edo period. Reizan's approach emphasized the importance of both theoretical study and practical application, arguing that true understanding could only be achieved through the integration of knowledge and action. This integration of theory and practice appealed to the samurai temperament, which valued effectiveness and results over abstract speculation. Neo-Confucian concepts like the rectification of names and the investigation of things provided intellectual tools that could be applied to practical problems of administration and governance. But perhaps the most important Neo-Confucian concept for samurai culture was the idea of self-cultivation through moral and intellectual development. This concept provided a framework for understanding personal growth that complemented and enhanced traditional martial training, creating comprehensive programs of development that addressed all aspects of human potential. The samurai scholars who embraced this approach created some of the most sophisticated philosophical works in Japanese history. Yamaga Soko developed a systematic analysis of Bushido that integrated Confucian ethical principles with traditional warrior values, creating a theoretical foundation for samurai culture that influenced military thinking for generations. His work Shido presented a comprehensive vision of the ideal warrior as a morally cultivated individual whose martial skills served larger social and spiritual purposes. Yamamoto Tsunetomo, author of the famous Hagakure, took a different approach that emphasized the psychological and spiritual dimensions of warrior culture. His work, compiled from conversations with a disciple during his retirement, presented a more mystical and intuitive understanding of Bushido that stressed the importance of total commitment and acceptance of death as the foundation for authentic living. The contrast between these approaches reflected broader tensions within Edo period samurai culture, between different ways of understanding the warrior's role in a peaceful society. Some thinkers emphasized the samurai's responsibility as administrators and cultural leaders, arguing that their martial heritage gave them special qualifications for governing and educating others. Others focused on the inner spiritual development that martial training could provide, treating warrior culture as a path to personal enlightenment rather than primarily as preparation for social service. These philosophical developments were not merely academic exercises, but had practical implications for how samurai understood their identity and purpose in a changing world. The educational curricula that were developed for samurai youth incorporated both classical Chinese texts and contemporary Japanese works, creating a sophisticated program of intellectual development that prepared young warriors for leadership roles in an increasingly complex society. While Musashi remained the most famous swordsman of the early Edo period, he was part of a remarkable generation of martial artists who collectively transformed Japanese swordsmanship from a practical battlefield skill into one of the world's most sophisticated systems of physical and spiritual development. These masters created the theoretical foundations and training methods that would govern martial arts education for the next 3 centuries. Itaru Hideyoshi, founder of the influential Itaru school of swordsmanship, developed techniques and teaching methods that emphasized the importance of timing and mental preparation over purely physical strength or speed. His approach to sword training incorporated elements of Zen meditation and focused on developing the kind of instantaneous response and perfect timing that could only be achieved through years of disciplined practice and mental cultivation. The Itaru curriculum that Hideyoshi created became the model for systematic martial arts education, with clearly defined levels of advancement and specific requirements for each stage of development. Students began with basic physical conditioning and fundamental techniques, gradually progressing through increasingly sophisticated training that integrated technical skill with philosophical understanding and spiritual development. Yagyu Munenori, founder of the Yagyu Shinkeiji-ryu, served as sword instructor to the Tokugawa shoguns, and developed an approach to martial arts that emphasized the political and social dimensions of warrior culture. His work, Heiho Kaidensho, presented swordsmanship as a form of statecraft, arguing that the principles that governed effective combat could be applied to all forms of human conflict and cooperation. Munenori's approach was particularly influential because it provided theoretical justification for the continued importance of martial arts in a peaceful society. He argued that the mental discipline and strategic thinking developed through sword training were essential qualifications for leadership and governance, making martial arts education crucial for anyone who aspired to positions of responsibility. The Yagyu school's emphasis on practical application and political relevance made it particularly attractive to ambitious samurai who sought to advance their careers through government service. The school's students included many of the most important political and military leaders of the early Edo period, ensuring that its influence extended far beyond the narrow world of martial arts specialists. Takuan Soho, a Zen monk who served as spiritual advisor to several prominent swordsmen, developed the most sophisticated analysis of the psychological and spiritual dimensions of martial arts training. His work, The Unfettered Mind, explored the relationship between martial arts practice and Buddhist meditation, arguing that true mastery in either discipline required the development of a mind that was simultaneously focused and flexible, alert and relaxed. Takuan's insights into the mental aspects of combat training influenced virtually every subsequent development in Japanese martial art. His analysis of concepts like no mind and immovable wisdom provided psychological frameworks that helped martial artists understand and develop the mental states that were necessary for peak performance. The integration of these different approaches created a remarkably sophisticated system of human development that used martial arts training as a vehicle for cultivating all aspects of human potential. Physical conditioning developed strength, flexibility, and coordination. Technical practice refined skill and precision. Strategic study enhanced analytical thinking and decision-making ability. Philosophical reflection deepened understanding of ethical and spiritual principles, and psychological training developed the mental clarity and emotional stability that were necessary for effective action under pressure. This comprehensive approach to martial arts education created a generation of samurai who were not only skilled fighters but also accomplished scholars, administrators, and cultural leaders. The integration of martial and civilian pursuits that characterized the best of Edo period samurai culture represented one of the highest achievements in human education, creating individuals who combined practical effectiveness with cultural sophistication in ways that have rarely been equaled. As the Edo period progressed and memories of actual warfare faded, the samurai class faced increasing challenges to their traditional identity and social position. The peace and prosperity that their sacrifices had helped to create gave rise to new forms of culture and entertainment that often seemed to mock or trivialize the values that warriors held most dear. This tension between traditional samurai culture and the emerging popular culture of the cities created a crisis of meaning that would ultimately contribute to the transformation of Japanese society. The most visible symbol of this new urban culture was the pleasure quarters, licensed districts where merchants, artisans, and even samurai could escape from the rigid social hierarchies and moral constraints of everyday life. These areas, known collectively as the floating world, developed their own forms of art, literature, and entertainment that celebrated hedonism, materialism, and individual pleasure in ways that directly contradicted traditional Bushido values. The popularity of the pleasure quarters among all social classes, including many samurai, created a fundamental contradiction in Edo period society. The same warriors who were supposed to embody self-discipline, loyalty, and contempt for material pleasures were often the most enthusiastic patrons of establishments that existed solely to provide sensual gratification and escapist entertainment. This contradiction was reflected in the literature and art of the period, which often portrayed samurai characters struggling to reconcile their ideals with their desires, their public duties with their private inclinations. The great plays of Chikamatsu Monzamon explored themes of conflicted loyalty and impossible choices, while the woodblock prints of artists like Utamaro and Hokusai depicted a world where traditional social distinctions seemed irrelevant or absurd. The economic dimension of this cultural conflict was equally problematic for the samurai class. Their fixed stipends, based on rice production, became increasingly inadequate as the economy became more commercialized and inflation reduced their purchasing power. Many samurai found themselves economically dependent on merchants and moneylenders, creating a situation where the theoretically superior warrior class was actually subordinate to the supposedly inferior commercial class. Some samurai responded to these challenges by embracing the new urban culture and abandoning traditional warrior values altogether. These individuals became known as Hatamoto Yokko, adopting flamboyant dress, engaging in public brawling, and generally behaving in ways that scandalized conservative observers. While they retained their legal status as samurai, they had effectively abandoned any meaningful connection to warrior culture. Others responded by retreating into increasingly rigid adherence to traditional forms and values, rejecting any accommodation with modern realities and insisting on the absolute superiority of ancient ways. These conservatives often became isolated from mainstream society, creating closed communities that preserved traditional practices, but had little influence on contemporary development. But the most creative response came from samurai thinkers and artists, who sought to find new ways of expressing traditional values that could be meaningful in contemporary circumstances. These individuals created new forms of literature, art, and philosophy that maintained essential elements of warrior culture while adapting them to the realities of urban commercial society. The development of new forms of popular entertainment that incorporated samurai themes and values was particularly important in this regard. Kabuki theater, which emerged during the early Edo period, created dramatic presentations of historical events and legendary warriors that helped maintain public awareness of samurai ideals while adapting them to contemporary tastes and sensibility. Similarly, the emergence of the novel as a literary form provided new opportunities for exploring the psychological and social dimensions of warrior culture. Works like The Tale of the 47 Ronin became enormously popular because they presented traditional themes of loyalty and revenge in forms that contemporary audiences could understand and appreciate. By the mid-18th century, it had become clear that the samurai class was facing a fundamental crisis of relevance that threatened not only their social position, but their very identity as a distinct group within Japanese society. The practical skills that had originally justified their privileged status were no longer needed. The administrative functions they performed could be handled by educated commoners, and the cultural values they embodied often seemed anachronistic in an increasingly commercialized society. This crisis was most acute among the lower ranks of the samurai class, particularly the large numbers of masterless warriors, Ronin, who had been displaced by the political consolidation of the early Edo period. These individuals retained their legal status as samurai but lacked the economic security or social position that made that status meaningful. Many were forced to take up occupations that were considered beneath their dignity, working as teachers, craftsmen, or even laborers to support themselves and their families. The psychological impact of this economic and social displacement was profound. Traditional samurai culture had been built around concepts of honor, duty, and service that assumed a clearly defined social role and a stable relationship between individual merit and social reward. When these assumptions no longer held, many samurai experienced a crisis of meaning that led to various forms of social deviance and personal dysfunction. Some ronin turned to violence and criminality, using their martial skills for personal gain rather than social service. Others became professional protesters and agitators, offering their services to anyone willing to pay for demonstrations or disturbances. Still others retreated into alcohol, gambling, or other forms of escapism that provided temporary relief from the contradictions of their situation. But the crisis of relevance was not limited to the masterless samurai. Even those who retained secure positions within the established system often struggled to find meaningful ways of expressing their warrior identity in a society that no longer needed warriors. The ceremonial duties and administrative responsibilities that occupied most of their time seemed trivial compared to the life and death struggles that had shaped their ancestors' lives. This sense of purposelessness led to various attempts to revitalize samurai culture through artificial means. Some domains organized elaborate military exercises and mock battles that were supposed to maintain warrior skills and esprit de corps. Others created new rituals and ceremonies that were intended to preserve traditional values in contemporary form. Still others promoted neoclassical movements that called for a return to ancient ways and the rejection of modern innovations. These efforts had limited success because they addressed symptoms rather than causes. The fundamental problem was not that samurai had forgotten their traditions, but that those traditions were no longer relevant to contemporary reality. No amount of ceremonial reverence for the past could restore the social and economic conditions that had originally made warrior culture meaningful and necessary. The most perceptive samurai thinkers recognized that their class needed to find new ways of justifying its existence and contributing to society. Some advocated for educational reform that would make samurai the leaders of intellectual and cultural development. Others promoted economic initiatives that would make warrior communities self-sufficient and productive. Still others called for political reforms that would give samurai more meaningful roles in governance and administration. These reform efforts met with varying degrees of success, but they all shared the recognition that samurai culture needed to evolve in order to survive. The alternative was gradual obsolescence and eventual disappearance as a distinct social group, a fate that seemed increasingly likely as the 18th century progressed and the gap between samurai ideals and social realities continued to widen. The arrival of Commodore Matthew Perry's black ships in Edo Bay in 1853 precipitated the greatest crisis in Japanese history since the Mongol invasions of the 13th century. For the first time in over 2 centuries, Japan faced a foreign threat that could not be ignored or deflected through diplomatic means. The superior technology and aggressive intentions of the Western powers demanded a response that would test every aspect of Japanese society and culture. For the samurai class, this crisis represented both the greatest challenge and the greatest opportunity they had faced since the establishment of the Tokugawa system. On one hand, the obvious obsolescence of traditional Japanese military technology highlighted the irrelevance of the martial skills that had been the foundation of samurai identity. Perry's steam-powered warships and modern cannon demonstrated that centuries of sword training and martial philosophy were useless against enemies who fought with industrial weapons and scientific methods. But on the other hand, the foreign threat created a new need for the kinds of leadership, discipline, and willingness to sacrifice that had always been the most valuable contributions of the warrior class. If Japan was to respond effectively to Western pressure, it would need leaders who could think strategically, act decisively, and inspire others to make the sacrifices necessary for national survival and transformation. The initial samurai response to the Western challenge was confused and contradictory, reflecting the deep divisions that had developed within the warrior class during the peaceful Edo period. Conservative samurai called for the immediate expulsion of all foreigners and a return to traditional isolation. arguing that Japanese spiritual superiority would eventually overcome Western material advantages. Progressive samurai advocated for the rapid adoption of Western technology and methods, even if this required fundamental changes in Japanese society and culture. Between these extremes were more moderate voices that sought to find ways of preserving essential elements of Japanese culture, while adopting whatever Western innovations were necessary for national security and independence. This middle position, often summarized in the slogan "Eastern Ethics, Western Science," would ultimately become the foundation for Japan's response to the Western challenge. The debates that raged among samurai intellectuals during the 1850s and 1860s revealed both the strengths and weaknesses of their traditional education and cultural background. Their training in classical Chinese philosophy provided sophisticated frameworks for analyzing political and social issues, while their experience in administration and governance gave them practical insights into the challenges of implementing policy change. But their isolation from foreign ideas and their commitment to traditional hierarchies made it difficult for them to understand the full implications of the transformations that would be necessary. The resolution of these debates came through a series of political and military crises that forced Japanese leaders to choose between fundamental reform and national subjugation. The signing of unequal treaties with Western powers, the overthrow of the Tokugawa shogunate, and the restoration of imperial rule in 1868 were all steps in a process of revolutionary change that transformed Japan from a feudal society into a modern nation-state within a single generation. The samurai played crucial roles in all phases of this transformation, but not always in ways that preserved their traditional identity or social position. Many of the leaders of the Meiji Restoration were samurai who used their education and organizational skills to create new political institutions and policy. But the success of these reforms ultimately required the abolition of the very class system that had given samurai their privileged position in Japanese society. The Meiji Restoration of 1868 marked the beginning of the end for the samurai as a legally distinct social class, even though many individual samurai played important roles in the modernization process that followed. The new government, dominated by reform-minded samurai from the southwestern domains, understood that Japan's survival in the modern world required fundamental changes that would eliminate many traditional institutions and practices. The abolition of the Han system in 1871 removed the feudal domains that had been the foundation of samurai power and identity for centuries. The establishment of a modern conscript army in 1873 eliminated the military monopoly that had justified samurai privilege. The commutation of samurai stipends in 1876 removed the economic support that had allowed warriors to maintain their traditional lifestyle, and the prohibition of sword-wearing in the same year eliminated the most visible symbol of samurai state. These reforms were implemented by a government that included many former samurai, but they represented a deliberate decision to sacrifice traditional warrior culture for the sake of national modernization and strength. The reformers understood that Japan could not compete with Western powers while maintaining a feudal social system based on hereditary privilege, rather than merit and efficiency. The samurai response to these changes was varied and often contradictory. Some embraced the new opportunities for advancement that modernization created, using their education and leadership experience to succeed in business, government, or the profession. Others resisted the changes through political opposition or armed rebellion, insisting that traditional values were more important than material progress or international acceptance. The most dramatic expression of samurai resistance was the Satsuma Rebellion of 1877, led by Saigo Takamori, one of the heroes of the Meiji Restoration, who had become disillusioned with the direction of government policy. Saigo's revolt attracted thousands of disaffected samurai who saw it as a last chance to preserve traditional warrior culture against the forces of modernization and Western. The defeat of Saigo's forces by the new conscript army was more than just a military victory for the Meiji government. It was a symbolic demonstration that the age of the samurai had ended forever. The sight of peasant soldiers, armed with modern rifles, defeating samurai warriors with traditional weapons, made it clear that personal valor and martial skill were no longer decisive factors in military conflict. But the end of the samurai as a legal class did not mean the disappearance of samurai values and traditions from Japanese society. Many of the principles that had governed warrior culture were incorporated into new institutional forms that made them available to all citizens rather than just a hereditary elite. The educational system emphasized discipline, loyalty, and service to the state. The military adopted codes of honor and behavior that drew heavily on samurai traditions, and the emerging industrial economy valued the kinds of dedication and attention to excellence that had characterized the best aspects of warrior culture. The transformation of samurai ideals into national values was facilitated by intellectuals and educators who had been trained in traditional warrior culture, but who understood the need to adapt these traditions to modern circumstances. Figures like Fukuzawa Yukichi, founder of Keio University, and Nitobe Inizo, author of Bushido, The Soul of Japan, played crucial roles in reinterpreting warrior traditions for a modern audience. This process of cultural translation was not without its problems. The emphasis on loyalty and obedience that had been appropriate for individual warriors serving feudal lords became potentially dangerous when applied to modern nation-states with imperial ambition. The romantic idealization of death in battle that had inspired individual samurai could become a destructive force when applied to entire population, and the hierarchical thinking that had helped maintain social order in feudal society could become an obstacle to the kind of flexible adaptation that modern societies require. As Japan modernized rapidly during the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the traditional samurai code of Bushido underwent a complex transformation that adapted ancient warrior values to the needs of a modern industrial nation. This process created new forms of ethical and cultural expression that preserved essential elements of samurai tradition, while making them applicable to all citizens regardless of social background. The most influential figure in this transformation was Nitobe Inizo, 1862-1933, whose book Bushido, The Soul of Japan, introduced Western audiences to Japanese warrior culture, while simultaneously creating a new interpretation of that culture for modern Japanese readers. Nitobe's Bushido was not simply a description of historical samurai practices, but a philosophical system that could guide the behavior of contemporary individuals in all walks of life. Nitobe's interpretation emphasized the ethical and spiritual dimensions of warrior culture, while downplaying its more violent and hierarchical aspects. His Bushido stressed virtues like integrity, courage, benevolence, and self-discipline that could be practiced by anyone, not just members of a hereditary military class. This democratization of warrior ideals made them more compatible with modern democratic and egalitarian values, while preserving their essential motivational and character-building function. The educational system that was established during the Meiji period incorporated many elements of this modernized Bushido into its curriculum and institutional culture. Students were taught to value group harmony, respect for authority, dedication to excellence, and willingness to sacrifice personal interests for collective goals. These values were presented not as specifically samurai traditions but as essential elements of Japanese national character that distinguished Japan from Western societies. The military forces that were created during the Meiji period also drew heavily on reinterpreted samurai traditions, but they applied these traditions to a modern conscript army rather than a feudal warrior class. The imperial rescript to soldiers and sailors, issued in 1882, emphasized loyalty, duty, valor, faithfulness, and simplicity as the fundamental virtues of the modern Japanese soldier. These were clearly recognizable as adaptations of traditional Bushido principles, but they were presented as obligations of citizenship rather than privileges of class. This militarization of modernized Bushido had profound implications for Japanese society and foreign relations. The same values that had helped individual samurai achieve personal excellence and maintain social order became driving forces for national expansion and imperial ambition. The willingness to sacrifice that had once been limited to small numbers of professional warriors was now expected from entire populations in service of national goals. The industrial development that transformed Japan during this period also reflected the influence of adapted samurai values. The emphasis on craftsmanship, attention to detail, and continuous improvement that characterized Japanese manufacturing drew directly on traditions that had been developed in samurai workshops and martial arts schools. The loyalty and dedication that Japanese workers showed to their companies paralleled the relationships that had bound samurai to their feudal lords. But perhaps the most significant aspect of Bushido's transformation was its internationalization. As Japan became more involved in world affairs, modernized samurai values became part of the country's international image and diplomatic strategy. The discipline, reliability, and determination that were associated with Bushido made Japan seem like a trustworthy ally and a formidable opponent to other world powers. This international dimension of Bushido would have tragic consequences during the Pacific War, when romantic notions about samurai honor and warrior spirit led Japanese leaders to make strategic decisions that were based more on cultural idealism than practical calculation. The same values that had enabled Japan's rapid modernization and international success became obstacles to realistic assessment of military and political reality. The Pacific War of 1941–1945 represented both the culmination and the ultimate test of the modernized Bushido that had developed during the Meiji and Taisho periods. For the first time since the Mongol invasions of the 13th century, Japan faced an existential threat that required the mobilization of all national resources and the application of traditional warrior values on an unprecedented scale. The military leadership that guided Japan into war was deeply influenced by romanticized interpretations of samurai culture that emphasized spiritual power over material resources, willpower over industrial capacity, and death before dishonor over strategic calculation. These officers, many of whom traced their lineage back to samurai families, believed that Japanese spiritual superiority would ultimately overcome American material advantages, just as their ancestors had defeated the Mongols through divine intervention and superior fighting spirit. This confidence in spiritual over material factors led to strategic decisions that reflected samurai values but ignored modern military realities. The attack on Pearl Harbor was conceived as a surprise assault that would demonstrate Japanese determination and fighting spirit, similar to the kinds of sudden attacks that had brought victory to samurai leaders like Oda Nobunaga. The expectation was that American willingness to fight would collapse when faced with Japanese determination and courage. The early successes of Japanese forces in Southeast Asia and the Pacific seemed to confirm the validity of this approach. Japanese soldiers and sailors, trained in the traditions of absolute loyalty and willingness to die for their emperor, achieved victories against larger and better equipped forces through superior discipline, coordination, and fighting spirit. The fall of Singapore, the conquest of the Philippines, and the advance toward Australia demonstrated that modernized Bushido could still be an effective military force when properly applied. But as the war continued and American industrial capacity began to make itself felt, the limitations of an approach based primarily on spiritual factors became increasingly apparent. Japanese forces found themselves fighting an enemy that could replace its losses more quickly than they could inflict them, using weapons and equipment that were superior in both quantity and quality to anything Japan could produce. The traditional samurai response to overwhelming odds was to fight even more fiercely, to accept death rather than surrender, and to seek victory through spiritual transcendence of material limitation. This response was embodied in tactics like kamikaze attacks, banzai charges, and the defense of isolated positions to the last man. These tactics reflected the highest ideals of Bushido, but proved increasingly ineffective against enemies who fought according to different principles. The kamikaze attacks that began in 1944 represented the purest expression of samurai values in modern warfare. Young pilots, many of them barely out of their teens, voluntarily accepted missions that offered no possibility of survival in exchange for the chance to inflict damage on enemy forces. Their willingness to sacrifice their lives for their country and emperor embodied the ultimate expression of loyalty and duty that had always been central to warrior culture. But the tactical effectiveness of these attacks was limited by the same technological and industrial factors that characterized the entire war. American ships were increasingly well defended against air attacks, and the loss of experienced pilots weakened Japanese air power more than the attacks weakened American naval capacity. The spiritual impact was enormous, but the material results were insufficient to change the course of the war. The civilian population's response to the war also reflected the influence of modernized Bushido values. The concept of 100 million hearts beating as one mobilized Japanese society for total war in ways that drew directly on traditions of loyalty, sacrifice, and collective action that had been developed in samurai culture. Women worked in factories with the same dedication that samurai had shown in serving their lords, while children were trained in military discipline and prepared to fight to defend their homeland. This total mobilization of society according to warrior principles created a level of national unity and determination that impressed even Japan's enemies. But it also made rational calculation of costs and benefits increasingly difficult, as any suggestion of compromise or surrender was seen as a betrayal of the sacrifices that had already been made. The ultimate test of this approach came with the American bombing campaign against Japanese cities and the final battles for Iwo Jima and Okinawa. Japanese defenders fought with a ferocity and determination that reflected the highest traditions of samurai culture, inflicting heavy casualties on American forces and demonstrating that the warrior spirit remained strong despite overwhelming material discipline. But these battles also demonstrated the tragic consequences of applying traditional warrior values to modern industrial warfare. The deaths of hundreds of thousands of soldiers and civilians achieved nothing except the prolongation of a conflict whose outcome had already been determined by factors beyond the influence of individual courage or spiritual determination. The surrender of Japan in August 1945 marked the end of the most traumatic period in Japanese history since the Mongol invasions. But it also created opportunities for the renewal and reinterpretation of traditional values that had been distorted by militarism and ultranationalism. The occupation period and the subsequent reconstruction of Japanese society provided a chance to rediscover the positive aspects of samurai culture while abandoning the destructive elements that had contributed to the disaster of war. The process of national reconstruction that began under American occupation required many of the same qualities that had characterized the best aspects of traditional samurai culture: discipline, determination, willingness to sacrifice immediate gratification for long-term goals, and the ability to adapt to completely new circumstances while maintaining essential values and identity. The Japanese people's response to defeat and occupation demonstrated that these qualities had survived the war and could be channeled toward peaceful and constructive purposes. The economic development that transformed Japan from a devastated war zone into one of the world's most prosperous countries within a generation reflected many principles that could be traced back to samurai tradition. The emphasis on quality, attention to detail, and continuous improvement that characterized Japanese manufacturing drew directly on craftsman traditions that had been developed in samurai workshops and refined through centuries of martial arts practice. The corporate culture that had emerged during Japan's economic miracle also showed clear influences from warrior traditions, though adapted to peaceful and productive purposes. The loyalty that employees showed to their companies paralleled the relationships that had bound samurai to their feudal lords. The emphasis on group harmony and collective decision-making reflected values that had been essential for military unit cohesion. The willingness to work long hours and sacrifice personal comfort for organizational success demonstrated the same dedication that had characterized the greatest samurai leader. But perhaps the most significant development was the revival and international spread of traditional Japanese martial arts as vehicles for personal development rather than military training. Arts like judo, karate, aikido, and kendo found enthusiastic audiences around the world among people who were attracted not just to their physical techniques, but to their philosophical and spiritual dimension. This internationalization of Japanese martial arts represented a form of cultural victory that was far more significant than any military conquest. People from every continent and culture found value in training methods and philosophical approaches that had been developed by Japanese warriors over centuries of refinement and practice. The principles of discipline, respect, and continuous self-improvement that were embedded in these arts proved to have universal appeal and applicability. The success of Japanese martial arts abroad also helped to rehabilitate the image of samurai culture, which had been tarnished by its association with militarism and aggression during the war period. Foreign practitioners of these arts encountered samurai traditions in their most positive forms, as methods for developing character, maintaining health, and achieving personal excellence through dedicated practice and mutual respect. Within Japan itself, the post-war period saw a revival of interest in traditional culture that included serious study of samurai history and philosophy. Scholars began to distinguish between the authentic traditions that had developed over centuries of peaceful cultivation and the distorted interpretations that had been promoted during the militaristic period. This scholarly work helped to restore understanding of samurai culture as a sophisticated system of human development rather than simply a military tradition. The constitutional pacifism that Japan adopted after the war created an environment where the peaceful aspects of samurai culture could flourish without the risk of being perverted into support for military aggression. The martial arts could be practiced as ways of developing character and maintaining health. The philosophical traditions could be studied for their insights into ethics and human nature, and the aesthetic traditions could be appreciated for their contributions to world culture. As the 21st century progresses, the influence of samurai culture continues to spread and evolve in ways that would have amazed the original warriors who developed these traditions centuries ago. From corporate boardrooms to martial arts dojos, from philosophical discussions to popular entertainment, the principles and practices that emerged from the experience of Japan's warrior class continue to influence how people around the world think about leadership, personal development, and the pursuit of excellence. The business world has been particularly receptive to samurai-influenced concepts, with many successful companies and leaders adopting principles that can be traced back to warrior traditions. The emphasis on long-term thinking over short-term gains reflects the strategic patience that characterized great samurai leaders like Tokugawa Ieyasu. The focus on continuous improvement, kaizen, draws directly on the relentless self-discipline that martial artists developed through years of practice. The importance placed on loyalty and team cohesion echoes the bonds that held samurai units together in the face of overwhelming challenges. Management philosophies based on samurai principles have been successfully implemented in diverse cultural contexts, suggesting that these approaches to human organization and motivation have universal validity. The servant leadership model, which emphasizes the leader's responsibility to serve and develop subordinates, reflects the traditional samurai understanding that authority exists primarily to fulfill obligations rather than to enjoy privileges. The educational applications of samurai-derived principles have been equally influential. Martial arts programs in schools around the world use traditional training methods to develop not just physical skills but also discipline, respect, and self-confidence. The integration of character development with skill acquisition that characterizes the best martial arts instruction provides a model for holistic education that addresses all aspects of human potential. The therapeutic applications of martial arts and related practices have opened new frontiers for the application of samurai tradition. Programs that use martial arts training to help troubled youth, treat PTSD in veterans, or provide physical and emotional therapy for various conditions demonstrate the healing potential that was always present in these traditions, but has only recently been systematically explored. The philosophical and spiritual dimensions of samurai culture continue to attract serious students who are seeking frameworks for understanding purpose, meaning, and ethical action in complex modern circumstances. The integration of practical skill development with moral cultivation that characterize the best samurai education provides a model for personal development that addresses both individual excellence and social responsibility. Popular culture has also played an important role in spreading awareness of samurai traditions, though not always in forms that accurately represent their historical reality. Movies, television shows, novels, and video games that feature samurai characters and themes have introduced millions of people to basic concepts of warrior culture, even if they often present romanticized or distorted versions of historical reality. This popular interest has created opportunities for more serious engagement with authentic samurai tradition. Many people who first encounter these ideas through entertainment media are motivated to seek deeper understanding through martial arts training, philosophical study, or historical research. The challenge for educators and practitioners is to build on this initial interest while correcting misconceptions and providing access to more authentic forms of the tradition. The technological revolution that characterizes the modern world has created new contexts for applying samurai principles while also creating new challenges for their preservation and transmission. Online communities of martial artists and students of Japanese culture can share knowledge and experiences across vast distances, but they also risk losing the personal relationships and direct transmission that were essential elements of traditional education. The development of virtual reality and other advanced technologies offers unprecedented opportunities for experiencing and learning about historical periods and cultural traditions. Future students may be able to walk through reconstructed samurai castles, participate in virtual tea ceremonies, or practice sword techniques with digitally recreated masters. But these technological tools must be balanced with authentic human relationships and direct experience if they are to convey the full depth and richness of the traditions they represent. As we look toward the future, certain principles that emerged from samurai culture appear to have enduring relevance that transcends their historical origins and cultural context. These eternal principles represent distilled wisdom about human nature, social organization, and the pursuit of excellence that may prove valuable regardless of how technology and society continue to evolve. The principle of continuous self-improvement, embodied in the concept of kaizen, recognizes that perfection is not a destination but a direction. The samurai understanding that mastery requires lifelong dedication and constant refinement provides a framework for approaching any skill or discipline with the patience and persistence necessary for true excellence. In a world of rapid change and increasing complexity, this long-term perspective becomes increasingly valuable. The integration of physical, mental, and spiritual development that characterize samurai education offers an alternative to the fragmentation that often characterizes modern life. The warrior's understanding that true strength requires harmony between body, mind, and spirit provides a model for holistic development that addresses all aspects of human potential. This integration becomes more important as the pace of technological change creates new forms of stress and alienation. The emphasis on service and responsibility that was central to Bushido offers a counterbalance to the individualism and materialism that can characterize modern societies. The samurai understanding that privilege creates obligation, that strength should be used to protect the weak, and that personal excellence should serve larger purposes, provides ethical frameworks that remain relevant in contemporary context. The warrior's acceptance of impermanence and willingness to face death created a unique appreciation for the preciousness of life and the importance of living with purpose and intensity. This awareness of mortality, rather than creating morbid preoccupation, actually enhanced the samurai's ability to appreciate beauty, form meaningful relationships, and act with courage when courage was required. In an age when many people try to deny or avoid thoughts of death, this acceptance offers a path to more authentic and fulfilling existence. The discipline and focus that martial arts training develops provide tools for maintaining mental clarity and emotional stability in increasingly chaotic and distracting environments. The ability to concentrate completely on the present moment, to respond appropriately to immediate circumstances while maintaining awareness of larger patterns and purposes, becomes more valuable as information overload and constant connectivity create new challenges for human attention and decision-making. The respect for tradition combined with willingness to adapt that characterized the most successful samurai leaders offers a model for navigating change while maintaining essential values and identity. The understanding that forms may change while principles endure, that innovation should build on rather than destroy existing wisdom, provides guidance for individuals and organizations facing the need to evolve without losing their core purpose and character. perhaps most importantly, the samurai demonstration that warrior qualities can be channeled toward creative and peaceful purposes, offers hope for humanity's ability to transcend its violent past, while retaining the strength and determination necessary for continued survival and development. The transformation of martial skills into artistic expression, of aggressive instincts into protective service, and of competitive drive into collaborative excellence, shows that human nature can be refined and directed toward constructive rather than destructive. As this comprehensive exploration of samurai history and culture draws to a close, we are left with questions about how these ancient traditions can and should influence our future development as individuals and as a global community. The samurai experience offers both inspiration and warning, demonstrating both the potential for human excellence and the dangers of carrying even noble ideals to extremes. The historical record shows that samurai culture was most beneficial when it emphasized personal development, social responsibility, and the integration of strength with wisdom. The periods when warriors focused on character building, artistic achievement, and service to their communities produced remarkable advances in human civilization and some of the most sophisticated philosophical and aesthetic traditions the world has ever seen. But the same record also shows the dangers that arise when warrior traditions are perverted into support for aggression, militarism, and the suppression of individual conscience in favor of blind obedience. The tragic consequences of Japan's militaristic period demonstrate that even the most noble traditions can become destructive when they are separated from their ethical foundations and used to justify actions that contradict their essential purpose. The challenge for contemporary students and practitioners of samurai-influenced traditions is to learn from both the successes and failures of the past. This requires developing the discrimination necessary to distinguish between authentic wisdom and harmful distortion, between time-tested principles and historical accidents, between universal truths and culturally specific application. The globalization of samurai-influenced practices creates both opportunities and responsibilities. As these traditions spread to new cultures and contexts, they will inevitably undergo transformation and adaptation. The question is whether these changes will preserve and enhance the essential value of the traditions or dilute and distort them beyond recognition. The key to beneficial adaptation lies in understanding the purposes that these traditions were designed to serve, and finding appropriate ways to fulfill those purposes in contemporary circumstance. If the goal is character development, then practices should be evaluated based on their effectiveness in developing character, rather than their fidelity to historical forms. If the goal is practical skill, then methods should be judged by their results rather than their traditional authenticity. But this adaptation must be guided by deep understanding rather than superficial attraction. The principles that governed samurai culture emerged from centuries of experimentation, refinement, and practical testing under extremely demanding conditions. Casual modification or combination with incompatible elements risks destroying the coherence and effectiveness that made these traditions valuable in the first place. The preservation and transmission of authentic samurai traditions also requires recognizing that they were always more than mere techniques or philosophy. They were comprehensive ways of life that integrated practical skills with ethical principles, individual development with social responsibility, and human achievement with respect for forces beyond human control. This integration cannot be maintained through purely intellectual study or occasional practice. It requires the kind of sustained commitment and personal transformation that characterized the original samurai education. Modern practitioners who want to benefit from these traditions must be willing to undergo the same kind of fundamental change in their priorities, habits, and understanding that the traditions were designed to produce. The ultimate test of any interpretation or application of samurai principles is whether it produces people who are stronger yet more compassionate, more capable yet more humble, more independent yet more willing to serve others. These paradoxical combinations of apparently contradictory qualities were the hallmarks of the greatest samurai leaders, and the goals toward which all authentic development in these traditions should aim. The way of the warrior, properly understood, is not about dominating others but about mastering oneself. It is not about avoiding conflict but about resolving conflict at the highest possible level. It is not about preserving the past, but about creating a future worthy of the sacrifices that previous generations made to bring us to this point. In this sense, the age of the samurai never ended. It simply evolved into new forms that continue to challenge us to be our best selves, to serve purposes larger than our individual desires, and to face whatever difficulties the future may bring with courage, wisdom, and unshakable commitment to what is right and true. The warriors who lived and died centuries ago in the mountains and valleys of Japan could never have imagined that their legacy would spread throughout the world and influence how people in every culture think about excellence, responsibility, and the pursuit of a meaningful life. But perhaps they would recognize that this global influence represents the ultimate victory of their deepest values, the demonstration that strength guided by wisdom, courage tempered by compassion, and individual excellence dedicated to collective benefit can indeed change the world for the better. The way continues, and it calls to each of us to walk it with the same dedication, integrity, and hope that inspired the greatest samurai of every generation. Their example lights the path forward, but it is up to us to take the next step.